Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Dyer, and you're listening to a reading of The Guardsman Party by Shaggy. Link to the full story will be in the description. I hope you enjoy. And as always, stay alive out there. The occurrence border took its time leaving the system. A whole day, in fact. There were 3 reasons for our lack of speed. Firstly, the tech priests that Jim had duped were seriously hindering any pursuit. Secondly, our bloody escape from the station and the news that we'd been the source of the psychic attack had really discouraged the few small independently owned ships that didn't rely on the Mechanicus to keep running. Finally, the locals' priorities had shifted drastically after a virulent fungal infection had started spreading through the station, driving men insane with visions and melting through just about anything. We actually felt a little bad about the whole warp fungus thing, but it really wasn't our fault, and it seemed like they managed to get it contained before the stuff ate more than an eighth of the station. Anyway, Hannah had been looking into the stuff after the Marines had stumbled into it, and we were pretty sure that it would die off or at least lose its hallucinatory properties without frequent exposure to the warp. So it would all probably work out in the end, and in the short term, it brought us a little more time to prepare for the upcoming weeks of warp travel. The last of our preparations were finished an hour before we were scheduled to re-enter the warp, and at Sarge's insistence, we all wandered down to our Geller Field adjacent quarters for a pre-post-whatever mission briefing. Tink and Amy were off to one side enjoying their usual pastime of antagonizing each other. The subject this time was the Tau vids Tink had acquired, specifically the ones that had been based on our exploits on the buffer worlds, and were supposedly earning us all sorts of royalties. Amy was loudly explaining that they were stupid, heretical, and concrete proof of Tink's perversion. Tink was holding that all of this was untrue, and that Amy was just jealous that she hadn't been included in the vids on account of being stuck on an island with a crazy Magos at the time. Doc was slumped over the table in the middle of the room. The medic had been on duty for nearly 20 hours before he'd been concussed and half-crushed, and when he'd gotten back to the ship, he hadn't been allowed to take a break. He wound up spending another 20 hours hopped up on stims, helping get Gravis stowed away and treating all the armsmen who had been injured during the defense of the ship. Doc was completely out of it, and Nubby had taken the opportunity to draw some comical facial hair on him. The little trooper was augmenting his doodles with a pyramid of furniture balanced on and around Doc, and was gleefully egging Tink and Amy on. Twitch had taped up what he claimed was the only accurate map of the occurrence border's tainted sections, along one wall. I say claimed because none of us could read the damn thing, and looking at it for any length of time made our heads hurt. Twitch was alternatively sticking pins in the map and talking to a servo skull with a det pack strapped to it. Supposedly, the Cogitator Adept was watching the skull's vid feed and answering Twitch's questions via comm-bead, but none of us could really be sure. Finally, Fumbles was sitting in a corner of the room grimacing at a small Tau drone with a block of white material strapped to it. Theo was sitting on the far side of what was definitely a blast shield, excitedly taking notes. None of us paid that close attention to Sarge when he finally arrived, since Amy was chasing Tink around the furniture pile by that point, but that changed when Sarge dropped the large crate he was carrying with a hollow-sounding boom. Nubby, recognizing the crate, sidled away an appreciable fraction of the speed of light, and Fumbles, who could taste the rage boiling off of Sarge, rather more literally vanished from sight. Before either of them could make their escape, Sarge barked an order at Twitch, who pushed a big red button on the wall marked Panic. As the exit sealed and a few dozen proximity mines activated, the foul-smelling blur that was Nubby changed direction and vanished through the only door left, which led to the bathroom. He locked the door behind him. Sarge ignored the bathroom door and the hard-to-look-at corner where Fumbles was whispering at Theo to shut up about amazing readings and hold still. He turned his attention to the rest of us with a horrible, fixed grin, asking for a status report. Twitch and Amy hesitantly reported that about half of the boarders trapped in the tainted areas had been killed, captured, or found dead. The rest had either holed up in areas too dangerous to pursue, disappeared into the rat's nest of corridors, or outright vanished. Patrols and traps had been set to contain the demonic feeding frenzy that would occur in those areas when we entered the warp. Tink followed this up with a report on the generally good condition of the cells after the overhaul and confirmation that everything was ready for entering the warp. Finally, Doc was poked with a stick until he regained enough consciousness to confirm that Gravis was still alive and that the looted medical supplies would be enough to keep him that way for at least another few weeks. Sarge digested the 3 reports for a few seconds and then poked Doc awake again. In an almost gentle voice, he asked the medic if he knew how Gravis's other half was doing, because Sister Valerie said she couldn't find the freezer crate with the Space Marine's legs anywhere. Doc's tired brain kicked into overdrive, and he dredged up an image of a dented and bullet-pocked crate being pulled off of him and tossed to the side. He swore, attempted to leap to his feet, and was buried as the pile of chairs around him collapsed. Tink, exhibiting all the tact and self-preservation instinct of a lemming, a socially retarded lemming, burst into laughter. Sarge's attention immediately shifted to Tink. He opened the crate he'd carried in, took out the manifest taped to its lid, and skipped down to the section labeled Miscellaneous. His false grin completely gone, Sarge asked Tink if he knew where the 1 times data slate, fiducia pattern, 1 times Astartes grav chute and grapnel harness, 2 times single-shot grav flares, and involuntarily glanced toward the spot where Spot was hiding. He looked back to find that Sarge had somehow teleported across the room and was now practically nose-to-nose with him. That's when the shouting started. Of course, despite all the shouting, and the part where he dragged Nubby out of the bathroom and held him in the air by 1 leg, Sarge wasn't really that angry. Even though he'd grown rather stodgy since his promotion, he was still a guardsman, and he knew all about the importance of recycling. The truth was that after how badly our resupply mission had gone, he just needed to shout at someone. And the way we'd scavenged, disassembled, sold, or just plain lost a Space Marine's worth of war gear and legs was as good of an excuse as any. We put up with Sarge's stress-relieving tantrum and thanked the Emperor he hadn't found out about the power sword what the power sword had actually been traded for. I mean, Theo claimed that the chunk of Wraithbone was extremely valuable and a key to all sorts of psychic engineering, but he didn't actually have any idea how it worked or what he was going to do with it. Sarge, finding out that we'd lost the power sword because our captive Xenos wanted to commit some science on a spooky rock, would have resulted in some real shouting. So, once Sarge had started feeling better, and had mandated that Sister Valerie was now in charge of Gravis's bolter and what was left of his helmet, he brought the rest of us up to date on what he, the Adepts, and the Captain had decided. The gist of it was that we hadn't appropriated enough fuel to reach the system where Oak's lab was, so we were going to make another stop and would offload Gravis, send a message to Oak, and repair whatever damage the zoanthrope had caused by the point we were all there. Our response to this news was conflicted at best. We knew that we'd be wanting another pit stop by that point, but we really didn't want to go through all of that shit again, and since the astropaths were telling everyone that we were Inquisition impersonating heretics, it seemed inevitable. Sarge assured us that he, or at least the smarter people who worked for him, had figured out a solution. The theory was that the astropaths' lies would catch attention of the Inquisition pretty quickly, and they'd send out a team to investigate what had happened to the station. Unless the paths managed to purge all records of our visit, which would likely require killing pretty much everyone in the Administratum from the Prefect on down, it'd be relatively easy for the Inquisition to identify us based on vid records of Sarge and our ship, and determine that the astropaths were full of shit. Then, after a judicious amount of purging, they'd send out a follow-up sector-wide message to clear our names. The nearest Inquisition outpost was 5 days away from the station, so call it a week to hear about the problem and travel to the station, another week to sort things out and send the all-clear, and a third week just to be safe. The captain had mapped a route that wouldn't be too far off course and would take us to a nice developed Imperial system with an inquisitorial outpost of its own, just in case, in about 3 weeks. We'd de-warp really far out, so if the zoanthrope did its head explodey thing again, it probably wouldn't kill anyone, and then discreetly venture into comms range of the new planet to make sure that everything was okay before attempting to dock. It was a nice, sensible plan, and all we had to do was keep the zoanthrope contained and Gravis alive for 3 weeks of warp travel. Everyone except for Twitch accepted that it was the best option available, and we all went off to make our last preparations. 2 hours later, the Gellerfield kicked on into gear, and the warp drive tore a bloody hole in the fabric of reality, and we fervently hoped that this was our second-to-last warp journey with our stupid psychic bug. All in all, Taking everything into account, and relatively speaking, the trip went well. You know, by occurrence border standards. Especially if you ignore all the ominous stuff with the ghost Tyranids. Doc, per usual, spent most of the trip in the medbay looking after Sergeant Gravis. The bisected Space Marine's condition wasn't good. The Tyranid bioweapon that had been introduced into his system was unquestionably alive, and was constantly attacking what remained of his organs with a variety of poisons. Gravis's Space Marine biology was fighting back, but was seriously hindered by the gross trauma that he'd suffered, not to mention the loss of those organs in his lower torso. The only thing keeping Gravis alive was his power armor's automated Medicae system, a large pile of life support machinery and regular aid from Doc and Sister Valerie. Since he didn't have an entire medbay to run, Doc handled Gravis most of the time. Sister Valerie covered for him when he was occasionally needed elsewhere for more combat-oriented medical duties, and after a week of increasing grumpiness on both of their parts, her senior subordinate was put in charge of the night shift. Anyway, between Doc's steadily increasing experience treating the torsified Space Marine and the large amount of medical supplies that we'd requisitioned from the waste station Alimentum Primaris, Gravis was kept, if not stable, at least only gently teetering on the brink of death. Or at least, initially that is. While Doc babysat Gravis, Sarge evaluated his performance during the supply run. He was reasonably happy with the way things had gone after everything had fallen apart, but it seemed to him that a real interrogator would have been able to keep things from spiraling out of control in the first place. He eventually came to the uncomfortable conclusion that his current social skills were rather lacking, and that since the Emperor, or at least his Holy Inquisition, had dumped him into a role which required them, he was going to have to fix that. With an incredible amount of reluctance, Sarge visited the Diplomacy Adept's quarters and asked for a few lessons on the arcane art of talking to people without shouting. The Diplomacy Adept found teaching Sarge to be rather difficult, mostly because our fearless leader was so set in his ways. In Sarge's book, deception and disguise were accomplished using stuff like helmets on sticks, camo paint, and smoke grenades. Inquiry and intimidation shared a definition and involved little, if any, talking on his part, and the pages that covered blather and charm had been removed to make more space for the chapter that covered command. Regardless of the difficulty involved in reversing a lifetime's worth of sergeanty preconceptions, though, the two of them did make some progress as they traveled. Admittedly, it was very slow progress, and involved an awful lot of yelling, but progress nonetheless. For their part, Tink and his fellow xenoculturists made some progress of their own during the voyage. The wonder team of Theo, Jim, and Tink were in charge of the zoanthrope containment, with occasional assistance from the xenologist adept and Hannah, if it was that she was hiding from her problem-prone tech acolytes in the cells. They'd refurbished everything in record time before that we entered warp, and afterwards things had gone surprisingly smoothly. Thanks to all the parts Nubby had acquired, the psi suppressors, shielding, and warp shroud had all been repaired and improved to a point in which they were very nearly within the minimum required strength for containing a Delta-level psyker during warp travel, and the stasis field was working perfectly for a change. All that had to be done in the cells was a bit of daily inspection and maintenance, which was always carried out quickly because the zoanthrope had acquired an unsettling presence ever since Sarge's partially slagged shield had gotten wrapped around its head. It was hard to shake the feeling that despite the stasis field, the eyes under the metal were watching you. Of course, the reduced maintenance requirements of the cells meant that the nerds were able to spend time on other things. Other things, in this instance, translating to helping with important ship maintenance, in Jim's case, and committing all sorts of tech heresy, in Tink and Theo's case. Actually, you couldn't really call what Theo was doing tech heresy. It was more of a case of tech heathenism, him being a Xenos and all. He was quite fixated on the piece of wraithbone that we'd acquired, and spent every scrap of his free time tinkering with it. Some days he'd be wiring it into every device in the cells, other times he had it mounted on a drone and trailing fumbles through the ship, and occasionally he could be seen wandering around with the big white block strapped to his head like a demented hat. Tink said it was all very scientific. Jim and Hannah refrained from commenting, and the rest of us were just glad it kept the mouthy little Xenos busy. Tink, deprived of the helmet he was cannibalizing to upgrade Spot, and perhaps motivated by a sense of shame at his inappropriate behavior, not likely, dedicated his time to a more practical project, the damaged Emperor's Scythe's stealth shuttle. During our zoanthrope acquiring trip, the ship's tech acolytes had finished defungusing it, but after that they'd just left it there to sit in the shuttle bay on account of how it was completely non-functional. The fungus had eaten away at a lot of armor and stealth materials, and had pretty much destroyed the landing gear, but the real problem was that a bunch of spores had gotten into the shuttle's circuitry. Some of the best piloting, navigation, and stealth control systems a Forge World could make had been reduced to hunks of corroded metal and silicon. Jim and Hannah had declared the shuttle unfixable without the aid of a fully stocked manufactorum and access to the shuttle's blueprints. Tink, however, saw the shuttle as both a challenge and an opportunity, and it snuck a few parts of both Imperial and Xenos origin, which had nothing to do with psyker containment, onto the list that he'd given Nubby. When he'd found out about the project, Sarge briefly considered yelling at Tink for scavenging more of the Emperor's Scythe stuff, but decided it did technically count as repairing the shuttle, and we were already up to our eyes in Xenotech heresy anyway. Also, there was a chance we'd get a working stealth shuttle out of it. For their part, Jim and Hannah just ignored all mention of the shuttle and added its bay to the list of places that the tech acolytes weren't allowed to go. The rest of us didn't have any input on the subject because we were either busy with Gravis or dealing with an increasing level of warp activity in the occurrence border's tainted areas. The initial volume of anomalies and incursions had been expected. The things that usually discorporeated after finding the tainted sections devoid of anything living had swarmed the trapped borders and grown stronger. Several varieties of warp beasts, minor demons, reanimated corpses, and what Nubby could tell anyone who'd listen was a bloodthirster, despite its lack of height, axe, or wings, had tried to claw their way into more habitable sections of the ship during the first few days of transit. Thanks to the fact that we'd known the general location of the borders, the unholy horrors that had come through to find numerous traps, swarms of jetpack armed suicide skulls, and the hardened priest and armsmen that made up the ship's watch, and a few well-armed guardsmen were all waiting for them. Even with prepared positions and numerical superiority, though, tackling warp creatures can be tricky. Over the 3 days it took the last of the borders to expire, the demons and anomalies that manifested around them took a small but significant toll on the defenders. Some men were torn apart, others went insane, an unlucky few ran afoul of the occurrence border's chronic mechanical problems, and one or two forgot to check what was on the other side of a door before stepping through it. Of course, none of us were on the casualty list. Prior experience with this sort of thing, not to mention better quality weapons and a rather pragmatic approach to questions like, "Do you think that thing with the tentacles is still in there?" meant that we made it through without significant injury. Insignificant injuries and close calls are a different matter, mind you. Something in the third wave of demons threw Fumbles' power out of whack and caused a few burns and bruises for everyone present. And then there was a hairy moment when Twitch barely stopped Amy from stepping through a door that inexplicably opened into one of his minefields. After that one, Nubby's augmetic feet had to be plasma cut off and replaced on account of how he tried to kick a nurgling in the Nadgers. Oh, and the one time Doc came down to help with casualties, a priest he was treating tried to eat his face, and he had to be exorcised, see clubbed into unconsciousness, using his own book of holy verse. Anyway, things calmed down after the third day, and once the various bits and pieces had been incinerated, jettisoned, or tossed back into the tainted section, the bulkheads were released and everyone got back to their usual routine. Unfortunately, things don't stay calmed down. Over the next few days, reports started filtering in of creatures haunting the corridors near the tainted areas. This wasn't unusual in and of itself, since every time the navigator hit a bump in the warp, stuff would leak through all over the ship, and there had been a demonic incursion in the area to boot, but the witness reports were worrying. They matched the ones we'd received during our previous week of warp travel. The last time, Twitch, Amy, and Nubby, and Fumbles had tracked the problem down to an infestation of what appeared to be Tyranids. It turned out that they weren't proper Nids, though, since shortly after they'd all been killed, the bug's remains had sort of started reforming into a distinctly warpy amalgamation of flesh, and then they just sort of vanished when we finally dewarped. We decided that the whole thing had been some sort of warp phenomena caused by the psychic containment in the cells failing, and that the zoanthrope sort of passively was screwing with reality. This explanation was ruined by the fact that despite the cells being all fixed up, the warpy Nids had gone and come back. Or maybe they hadn't. It was all a bit of a mess. The problem was that this time, the Tyranid-shaped creatures that Nubby drew out with his damsel in distress routine were different. They had appearance and behavior that could be best described as ghost-like. Not ghost-like as in sneaky, but ghost-like as in like a ghost, literally. Now, the occurrence border was practically littered with warp ghosts, but human ones. For the most part, they just wandered around, reenacting their lives and deaths, and the occasional bout of unsettling whispering or screaming thrown in. They were harmless by and large, and even provided a decent entertainment on slow days, but they could change if someone or something managed to get their attention and drag them into sync with what passed for reality. Anyway, the Tyranids we found literally haunting the fringes of the tainted areas displayed all the signs of being warp ghosts except, Tyranid ones. The sort of milled around in the shadows, drifting through walls, making clicking noises at each other and gnawing at stuff that wasn't there, until we got too close or had Fumbles poke him. Then every ghost Nid in the area would swarm in around the agitated one and become an awful lot more solid until a few bolts of plasma blew them back into blue and green smoke. At first, the ghost Tyranids were just puzzling. Based on the little we knew about how the warp and what information our xenology adept could provide, it shouldn't have been possible. Your average Nid doesn't have a mind, much less a soul, and those are pretty much requirements for being a ghost. Otherwise, the warp would be littered with ghosts of bricks, trees, rocks, whatever. Everyone agreed that something odd was going on, but no one could figure out exactly what it was. At first, we just blamed the zoanthrope, but Jim and Theo checked and couldn't detect any psychic energy leaking from the cells, and Fumbles backed them up. Other theories were raised, such as the ghost Nids being a psychic projection built upon the crew's collective unconscious fear of the Tyranids, or them being the result of the hive mind reaching across the warp to smite us, or everything being caused by the ancient heathen insectoid idol stored in cargo bay E-71-3, which had drove all who looked upon it insane. These were all shot down for various reasons, such as the fact that, according to Old Bill, the idol's various limbs had been holding up plasma conduits for 13 years now without any significant problems. Twitch, of course, held fast to his theory that the Tyranids aboard the hive ship, which had sucked into the warp by the Scythe's vortex bomb, had made an alliance with the demons of chaos, and an unstoppable tide of demonids would rampage across the galaxy. But no one but Amy bothered to argue with him, and in the end, the rest of us decided that the ghost Tyranids were probably still somehow the zoanthrope's fault, despite all evidence to the contrary. To return to the point, though, the ghost Nids were puzzling at first. This wasn't because something happened which explained everything, it was because they quickly became far too serious of a problem to waste time actually thinking about it. The number of ghost Tyranid sightings quickly rose, as did the number of attacks. We'd tried to nip the problem in the bud. Of course, a busy 2 days had been spent antagonizing ethereal hormagaunts into solidity and then shooting them. Unfortunately, they didn't stay dead. Even when we got the Confessor himself to come down and wave his censer around after we shot them, it still took a few hours, but eventually a bug that Fumbles claimed was the same one would drift back to the spot we'd killed it and resume its seemingly random wandering. An expedition into the tainted areas to see where they were coming from was proposed, but after some careful thought, we decided that we didn't actually want to die horribly in a twisted nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry and bug-shaped warp monstrosities. We might have really considered it if the ghost Tyranids had seemed interested in launching attacks on the rest of the ship, but as far as we could tell, they were content to just sort of hang out. Over time, the steadily increasing number of ghost bugs would result in them wandering deeper into the ship, but otherwise they stayed out unless somebody got near them. Lacking any viable solution or motivation to take a real risk to find one, the captain agreed with our decision to just set up a kill zone around the tainted areas and contain the apathetic ghost tyrannid menace. The containment strategy wasn't sustainable in the long run, since the number of bugs were inexplicably rising, and they were able to expand in 3D as well as through walls too. But we were pretty sure that if we gave a little ground when the numbers got too high, we'd work long enough for us to reach our next resupply point. Also, if things got really bad, we could always de-warp and sort things out at the expense of a few days' travel time. So since there wasn't any immediate crisis, we settled into a slightly more stressful than usual routine and got right on with our lives. Amy assumed command of the entire lower aft portion of the defense. She didn't really ask for permission or anything, mind you. She just walked down there and started bossing everyone around. The only reason that the captain and his master-at-arms didn't kick up a huge fuss about this blatant disrespect was that Amy was actually very good at this sort of thing, having been born and raised for infantry command before her career change to inquisitorial gooning. The rest of us noticed that despite how much she complained about the poor quality of her troops or compared them to her old regiment, Amy seemed far happier than she'd been since her disastrous mission with the half-mad Magos, or if not happier, at least less prone to spontaneous fits of violence. Since Twitch, not to put too fine a point on it, wasn't really sane enough to command a squad, much less an entire flank of the defense, his assistance to the containment effort was a bit more ad hoc. He scampered around, shoring up defenses and setting up traps without any discernible rhyme or reason, and everyone else just had to adjust their deployments to fit. It was all surprisingly effective, although in retrospect it shouldn't have been, since he'd spent most of his time patrolling the borders of tainted areas more than anyone except Old Bill and his senior engineers, and knew which spots were defensible and which weren't by heart. Initially, Nubby just sort of mooched around the various fronts, assisting with the supply effort, but since his partner in petty crime was the only psyker around who wasn't busy steering the ship, this profitable arrangement didn't last. We'd quickly discovered that Fumble's ability to sense the ghost nids from quite far away and through walls was invaluable, especially since he could share what he sensed with anyone nearby. He was constantly in demand as a spotter, and Nubby was dragged along to act as backup and moral support. As had been mentioned, the rest of us had other things to do, and the ghost nid situation really didn't change that. I mean, if you stop work every time an army of warp-spawned insectoid spirits lays siege to your ship, you'll never get anything done. So we all just sort of muddled along, trying to hold everything together as the trip continued and things got progressively worse. In the case of Doc's treatment of Sergeant Gravis, got progressively worse is a perfect summary. The Space Marine's condition went steadily downhill, and not in the ways Doc or Valerie had been prepared for. There were seemingly random seizures, spikes in neural activity that indicated horrible nightmares, inexplicable changes in the behavior of the biotoxin, and even a few spontaneous mechanical failures in the life support machinery. It got to the point where Gravis watching was a 24-hour no distractions duty because the second he was left alone, something would invariably go wrong. Doc, not being born yesterday, blamed all of these problems on the warp in general and the zoanthrope in particular, but he couldn't figure out how or why, and had no idea what to do about any of it. Lacking any proactive treatment ideas aside from exiting the warp or killing the zoanthrope, Doc dedicated increasingly large portions of his time to Gravis watching and developed a rather disturbing tendency to talk to the comatose Space Marine. Tasteless jokes about Valerie getting jealous aside, we began to worry about him, but we were getting near the end of the trip by the time things got really worrying, and he seemed to recover a bit after his theory about the zoanthrope being the cause was confirmed. Actually, it wasn't just Doc's theory that was proven. Our suspicions about there being a link between the ghost nids and the zoanthrope were confirmed too. What had happened was that 3 days out from our destination, nearly a quarter of the psi suppressors in the cells failed all at once. This didn't come as a complete surprise, mind you. Even in stasis, the zoanthrope's mere psychic presence, not to mention the warp itself, had wore down the machinery and the shielding that restrained it. Tink, Theo, and Jim had been dedicating more and more of their time to inspections and maintenance, but there was only so much that they could do given the general cludged-together nature of the cells. So they'd been sort of ready for something like this to happen, and had made sure that someone was always on duty. When the failure happened, Jim had been right there to start fixing things, and both Theo and Tink had arrived within minutes to help. Sarge showed up too, but he hadn't actually been needed in any meaningful way. He just really wanted an excuse to ditch the horrible, self-inflicted purgatory of his diplomacy lessons. Anyway, during the 15 or so minutes of reduced psi suppression on the zoanthrope, the following happened. The spawn rate of ghost nids drastically increased. A few higher forms started appearing. The entire swarm began acting far more in touch with reality and became significantly harder to kill. All sorts of warp phenomena occurred throughout the ship. The temperature on the main atmospheric regulator got stuck at 7 degrees. This was probably unrelated, but by then we were blaming everything on the damned bug. Fumbles suffered some sort of combination hallucinatory and convulsive episode and wound up clawing at his face and breaking his goggles. The navigator sent us a very angry note about the importance of not distracting him while steering, and Sergeant Gravis caught fire. Again. So yeah, it was a pretty unpleasant experience, especially since it was actually a minor failure compared to some of the stuff that had broken during our last trip, and therefore raised all sorts of questions about the zoanthrope's powers. Not that we had much time for pondering, though, because the following 3 days were absolutely exhausting. Most of the problems caused by the failure were dealt with immediately. The suppressors were repaired without the zoanthrope breaking out of stasis and trying to kill everyone. Doc actually had a fire extinguisher ready to put Gravis out before the Eldritch Flames did any real damage, and handled everything else that went spontaneously wrong during the brief loss of suppression. Nubby managed to restrain Fumbles before he clawed out his own eyes. He got the Psyker to safety and was even able to scrounge up another pair of extra-large welding goggles, which may or may not have had Bill's Do Not Steal written on them. Lastly, thanks to a general retreat order by Amy and the captain, plus Twitch's suspiciously well-placed fallback points, relatively few men died on the temporarily empowered ghost nids. Unfortunately, even though the ghost nids lost focus and weakened again after the psi suppressors were back online, the increase in their numbers was permanent. Containment became significantly more difficult, especially since in some places the defense had been pushed back to rooms that old Bill said were important to the running of the ship. It wasn't a good situation, but then again, it could have been a lot worse. Both ammo and food were plentiful, it wasn't snowing or raining aside from the occasional drizzle of supernatural blood, and there weren't any commissars. On the official Imperial Guard scale of horrible meat grinder defenses, it was only about a 3. Of course, anything that even shows up on that scale isn't something you want to deal with while traveling through the warp. The question of whether to just de-warp in the middle of space and try to sort everything out was raised again, but since we were close to our destination, Sarge and the captain decided that we could tough it out. The rest of us reluctantly agreed and put everything we could into holding out 3 more days. Reinforcements were mustered from the crew, those wounded who could still fight were put back on the line, including a rather shaken Fumbles, and our fearless leader oh so regretfully abandoned the last of his diplomacy classes to personally take over the nastiest piece of the line. Finally, Tink and Theo were told that regardless of how creepy being around the zoanthrope was, and how important they felt their pet projects were, they now lived in the cells, and horrible things would happen to their vids if another mechanical failure occurred. It was a hectic, terrifying, and heroism-filled 3 days, which really reminded all of us of our time in the Guard, though with less indiscriminate shelling and rather inferior brand of trenchmates. Not that the armsmen of the Occurrence Border weren't good fighters, they just weren't Guardsmen. Anyway, complaints about troop quality aside, we managed to hold out without any more complete disasters. There were a few tense moments, such as when Tink got as far as reporting that a cascading suppression failure was imminent before he figured out how to use his plasma gun as a backup battery. We would have congratulated him on his ingenuity, but it took him about half an hour to remember to tell us that things had been stabilized and we weren't about to die. Another bad spot was when Sarge finally abandoned the forward power management, water purification, and toothpaste distribution room, only to have something break in it 5 minutes later after he left. It took a 3-hour counteroffensive spearheaded by all of us, except Amy, to get old Bill up there to fix the thing that had got stuck in the what's-it. In the end, though, we made it. A few hours before our originally scheduled dewarp time, but not a second too soon, we arrived at that bastion of Imperial civilization widely known as that system with 2 planets and an Inquisition base that's pretty much on the way. Not that one. No, the one with the blue star. As the occurrence border left the warp, the massive swarm of ghostly Tyranids just faded away. It was actually sort of awkward for those of us on the line, and a sheer paranoia kept everyone at their posts for nearly an hour before victory was declared, and we all went off to get some sleep. The only people left awake were those who had been augmented past the need for the pathetic meatbag concept of sleep, and the poor bastards in charge. Sarge hiked his way up to the bridge to verify that we were in the correct system and that no stellar disasters, Xenos invasions, or heretical uprisings were occurring in it, and sent a message to the Inquisition's base. Unfortunately, the last part proved unexpectedly difficult. Due to our recent problem with head-exploding waves of psychic energy, we came out of the warp way out on the edge of the system. Of course, the universe despises all rational planning, so the zoanthropes stayed completely quiet during the transition, and all of our careful precaution accomplished nothing aside from leaving us several days of normal space travel away from our destination. In fact, we were so far out that our sensors could barely even pick up the largest ships and stations around the planets, and it had been days before we got into Vox range. This annoyed Sarge, who wanted to get started on the whole process of proving our identity and requesting aid so he could stop worrying. The captain sympathized with him and rather sarcastically asked Sarge if he wanted to try to make a micro-warp to get closer to the planets. Sarge told him to go fornicate with a waterfowl and then wandered off to try to nap away his paranoia. The rest of us weren't concerned about the travel time, since moving through normal space was downright relaxing by our standards. It left us to our own devices, and we probably wouldn't have spent the entire time asleep, drunk, or watching heretical cartoons, but Sarge didn't approve of idle troops. After a mere 16 hours of sleep, he dumped every one of us into our nice warm bunks, gathered the entire team plus old Bill and Jim together, and began giving orders. The impromptu briefing started with Sarge informing us that the captain had spotted 3 ships of indeterminate size heading our way, and per tradition, Twitch interrupted to tell everyone that he had a bad feeling about this. After a few minutes had been wasted on half-comedic speculation, Sarge shared the captain's assurance that this was a perfectly normal response to how far out we'd warped in. He claimed that it was, in fact, a good thing, since they'd be able to help us by passing our Vox messages to the Inquisition base earlier than we'd expected. It'd still be over a day before we were in range, though, and in the meantime, there were things to do. Tink and Theo were told that their pet projects were still on hold until they made sure that every system in the cells were working fine and compiled yet another parts list. Doc, who was annoyingly chipper after his first real break from Gravis watching in over a week, was told to ditch the Marine on his girlfriend and get his gear ready. The adepts were told to do whatever adepty things needed to be done before we talked to whoever ran the local Inquisition base, except for the Cogitator adept, who was ordered to use his data thingies and compuwhatsits to figure out where the ghost nids had been coming from. He responded with a lot of useless technobabble and complaints about not being a demonologist, dammit, but after Sarge glared at him for a while, he went off to his closet and got to work. Everyone else was ordered to get ready for a short expedition. A few hours later, the Cogitator Adept delivered a data slate containing what Twitch and Old Bill assured us was a map marking 4 locations in the occurrence border's various tainted areas. The rest of us took their words for it, and Twitch was put in charge of deciphering it into 3-dimensional directions. Sarge chose the location in the lower aft tainted section as our first target on account of how it was near the other thing he wanted to sort out with the expedition, and we set out with Old Bill and his gaggle of engineers and tech acolytes in tow. Now, we called it an expedition and went in heavily armed, but outside the tainted areas weren't that dangerous. Yes, they were still contaminated with warp energy, which manifested all sorts of phenomenon, but they were generally minor things like whispers, winds, flashes of movement, and the other non-insectoid variety of ghost. The crutoids and other vermin which wandered into the area and wound up horribly mutated and occasionally possessed were only a minor inconvenience, and warp entities which can survive in normal space without some kind of hosts are rare. Really, it was just a matter of carefully avoiding mechanical hazards and the occasionally persistent anomaly, such as the time loop on subsection U3 and the room stuck at 5 degrees Kelvin, the time loop on subdeck U3, the perpetually bouncing ball, and the time loop on subdeck U3. I feel like I've heard that somewhere. Oh yeah, right here. We reached the area that the Cogitator Adept had calculated as the center of the Ghostnid infestation without any incidents, and more serious than a tech acolyte getting slightly electrocuted, and Nubby getting stuck during an attempt to bypass leaking plasma conduits via airshaft. Unfortunately, when we got there, we didn't find any demonic portals, eldritch devices, tyrannid hives, or anything else we could cover with det packs. All we found at the geographic center of the Ghostnid infestation was a few empty rooms and corridors. We had Fumbles take a look around just in case, but he claimed that the area were slightly more tainted than its surroundings. It seemed to him just like the side effect of being filled with Ghostnids for longer. We debated exploding the entire area, just on the off chance we would accomplish something, but Old Bill asked us politely not to. So lacking anything productive to do, we headed down to Cargo Bay E71/3, home of a few dozen plasma conduits and an insanity-inducing ancient heathen insectoid idol that had been repurposed as an architectural support. Operating on the theory that even if it wasn't related to our bug problem, it probably wasn't good to have a giant eldritch statue just sitting around in a warp-tainted cargo bay, we asked Old Bill to figure out a way to disentangle the plasma conduits from the idol. Not so we could study it, of course. That would be silly. We just wanted to make sure that the engines wouldn't explode or something when we destroyed the thing. Old Bill grumbled a bit about not fixing what isn't broken, but he and his boys threw a tarp over the thing's horrible, mind-shattering visage and began scavenging replacement parts from the surrounding area. A few hours later, the various plasma conduits, pipes, and wires being supported by the haphazard network of metal bands, clamps, crates of expired food, and 3 of the room's grav plates fastened to the ceiling. The tarp-covered idol was dragged to the center of the room, and a pair of meltabombs, and with what looked like suspiciously like cross-sized insignias on their sides, were fastened to it. The horrible chittering, screaming went on for quite a while, but it trailed away as we reached the edge of the tainted area, and nothing else really happened. Well, aside from an 11% drop in the efficiency of Engine 6 and half the aft sensors overloading, Old Bill said he told us so. By the time we got back from our expedition, the distance between us and the 3 approaching ships had closed to the bare edge of our Vox system's broadcast range. Now that they were closer, our sensors had identified the ships as Navy frigate and a pair of smaller SDF ships, so Sarge, the captain, and the Adepts decided not to mess around with subtlety and announce our identity and our intentions off the bat. Remembering his recent lessons on the importance of stance, dress, and overall first impressions, Sarge scrounged together a replacement for the inquisitorial costume and evil goon uniform, which had been rather gleefully abandoned in the men's room garbage bin after he'd more or less ripped Doc's evil goon uniform in half during his attempt to make it fit. He settled for wearing one of the captain's spare uniforms and hung his interrogator rosette in clear view. Suitably outfitted, Sarge then spent nearly 2 hours with the old diplomacy adept recording a 2-minute vid which primarily consisted of his name and rank, a request that his message be forwarded to the local Inquisition base, and the digital authorization code from his rosette. This arduous task completed, he joined the rest of us for a few games of cards while the message crawled its way across the system at the annoyingly slow speed of light. 4 hours and several thrones lost to Nubby and Fumbles later, it occurred to us that we really should have gotten a response by then, and we all trooped up to the bridge to see if something interesting was happening. We arrived just in time to hear one of the sensor techs report that all 3 approaching ships had increased their acceleration, and 4 more had left orbit, to which informed everyone that he really had a bad feeling about this. Over the next few hours, the vid was resent multiple times, a request for confirmation of receipt was added, an audio-only version was sent, and some tech acolytes were sent out in a shuttle to check that our Vox system was actually sending and receiving correctly. All this effort accomplished was absolutely jack shit aside from increasing the acceleration of the approaching ships even further and raising the local paranoia level to amazing heights. An emergency meeting of everyone who could contribute to a serious conversation on our options was called, and the rest of us invited ourselves along anyway. There was some initial complaining by Jim, the adepts, and other such stuffy people about how the whole meeting was pointless since no one actually knew anything useful about the situation, so all that anyone could do was make wild guesses based on hearsay and unsupported speculation. That sounded fine to us because it was how we made most of our decisions, and everything typically worked out, so we ignored their whining. The initial topic of conversation was just what in the Emperor's name was going on, and if there was any chance we could sort it out. All theories stating that the approaching ships were friendly and there was just some sort of inexplicable reason that they couldn't just talk to us were immediately thrown out on the grounds that the universe didn't work that way. Twitch's theory that the local naval forces had been taken over by an advanced force of demonids or possibly commandos was dismissed for similar reasons. The general consensus we arrived at was that the locals were following the astropathic kill order that had been sent out by the insane choirmaster, which had probably included something like disregard any messages they send, especially ones containing inquisitorial authorization codes. This raised a bunch of new questions, though, the primary one being, why the hell hadn't the Inquisition rescinded that order yet? Since it was unimaginable that the Inquisition hadn't noticed a sector-wide astropathic message to kill someone, much less a whole ship of people who were in their records as inquisitorial agents, we felt sure that an investigation into the incident on the station had at least been started. There was, of course, the remote possibility that whoever they'd sent to investigate had completely botched things and either swallowed the choirmaster's obvious lies or had been offed by the locals, but that seemed unlikely. Despite our personal experiences, the Inquisition on the whole is rather notorious for its incredulity and its competence. Doc suggested that the investigator's ship could have been lost in the warp, or that other warp travel-related shenanigans had occurred, such as our warp journey taking only a few hours of real time as opposed to the 3 weeks we'd experienced. The captain shot down that last explanation, claiming that he was absolutely certain, for some technical reason, that 3.5 weeks of real time had passed, but allowed that Doc had a point about the dangers of warp travel delaying the investigation. The diplomacy adept also raised a valid point, which was that given the time it would take for the investigation on the station and via direct route, no inquisitorial couriers would have reached the system before us. This means that these astropaths exploding people are not heretics, don't kill them order from the Inquisition would have been sent out via astropath, so there was a very real possibility that a few things got lost in translation. For instance, the no, not, and don't. Both of these explanations sounded good enough for us, but they didn't account for why the local Inquisition base wasn't doing anything, and that was more pressing concern at present. The whole reason that this system was our destination was because of the presence of an Inquisition base. We'd expected them to be able to help sort things out, as had apparently happened. Word of our innocence hadn't reached the system yet. Okay, it wasn't like they ran the local nabby, just they were a small Ordos Hereticus outpost. There were probably a few buildings full of adepts who kept track of things, a handful of stormtroopers who hung out waiting for the next emergency, and maybe 1 or 2 local inquisitors, if they weren't off purging heretics in another system at the moment. Size aside, though, they should have noticed half the ships in the system moving out at once, taking an interest and had been forwarded our messages. In the end, we put it down to massive incompetence. This wasn't a very good explanation, but the only one we could think of was some shadowy cabal of astropaths secretly controlling half the sector via careful manipulation of information, which was just silly. Seriously, who would ever heard of a bunch of astropaths secretly controlling anything? They were nuttier than squirrel poo and prone to randomly exploding. The argument about whether the idiot running everything was the person currently running the Inquisition base or someone in the local navy who was stonewalling them, for some arbitrary reason, was getting rather spirited when it was brought to an end by the arrival of the Occurrence Borders navigator. The tall and cadaverous man stalked in, probably attracted by all the shouting just a few rooms away from his sanctum, and informed us that we were all blunt-minded idiots. No one but Amy took much offense to this. In our experience, it was just the navigator's way of saying hello, and we all waited for for us to hear why we were a bunch of borderline retards. It turned out that what was happening was obvious, and he could have told us it would have happened if we had just talked to him. The statement right there is a classic example of why no one likes navigators. Our ship had just popped out of the warp at an odd location, positively reeked with warp taint, and had been powerful, unrestrained Tyranid psychic signature emanating from it. The occurrence border was a textbook example of a genestealer-infested ship looking to infiltrate a system. There was a short argument between the navigator and Tink about whether the zoanthrope was unrestrained or not. Tink ultimately lost because if the bug was properly restrained, we wouldn't have been up to our asses in ghost tyrannids for the last few weeks. But the navigator did eventually amend his statement to partially restrained by a bunch of incompetence heretics and Xenos. Anyway, the rest of us acknowledged that this was as good an explanation as any, since excessive paranoia seemed a bit more likely than plain incompetence, where the Inquisition was concerned, and asked of the navigator had any ideas on how to deal with such a situation. He suggested that we get the hell out of the system before we were all killed, and make sure that our next step was to somewhere where we personally knew people in power who could smooth things out. This suggestion did not go over well with Doc, Tink, or anyone else, really. In the end, despite all the complaining, Sarge and the captain decided to follow the navigator's advice. Doc's statement that Gravis would not survive another serious warp journey with the zoanthrope was noted, as was Tink's list of things in the cells that desperately needed replacement parts to continue functioning correctly, but those were future problems, and the incoming ships were very, very current ones. Once that critical decision was made, the entire mob relocated to the map room, where most of us just complained and made unhelpful suggestions, while Sarge, the captain, and our adepts tried to find a suitable destination. To our surprise, we actually knew a fair number of people who would be able to help us. There was the Inquisitor Oak, of course, as well as a few of our former interrogators, an overweight cross-dressing xenophile, the Rupert, and a few tech priests of various ranks. On top of that, the captain and the adepts were able to supply a few Navy officers and Inquisition contacts. Amy grudgingly admitted her mother would help if she asked, and Nubby said he knew a guy who was technically a planetary governor. The problem was that most of these people tended to move around a lot, and the ones who didn't were anywhere near our end of the Ultima Segmentum. Even without all the complications of making a long warp journey with Gravis and the zoanthrope, we just didn't have enough fuel to reach any of them. Mind you, if we'd have an astropath as opposed to a headless corpse in the morgue and a sanctum covered with bits of blood, brain, and bone, we might have gotten lucky and been able to track one of the mobile ones down nearby, but in that case we would have just sent a message asking our boss to sort all of this stuff out for us. After we examined the map and determined that no one was helpful within our 4-day travel range, the captain raised some less savory options. The discussion turned to what was or wasn't piracy, and whether any of the nearby systems were too small to have naval defenses or astropaths, but devolved quickly enough to have a supply of fuel. Sarge began to zone out as he imagined just how unpleasant his post-mission interview with the Inquisitor was going to be, and then he overheard Tink pestering the navigator. Tink asked if it was possible to coast in the warp, like fuel-conscious ships did in normal space, and thereby extend our range enough to reach the nearest guaranteed friendly system, which was unfortunately the one inhabited by Nubby's guy. The navigator made some sneering remarks about the Blunt's inability to truly understand the shifting nature of the warp, and admitted that yes, you could trade time for fuel up to a certain point. As the rest of us checked whether this would allow us to reach anyone who hadn't been described as like a planetary governor, but without the actual planet, and maybe a little bit more slavery, Sarge thought back to our original travel plans. He asked the navigator whether we could stretch 4 days of fuel to reach the destination a week and a half away, specifically the Ordos Xenos research facility that had ordered the zoanthrope. He got a flat no. That would have been the end of it right there, as things might have turned out very differently, but the Cogitator Adept was listening in and simultaneously responded with a maybe. That sparked a heated argument, which included a lot of talk about warp currents and something about problems with the shortest path. None of us really followed it, except maybe Tink, but the no and maybe slowly turned into a probably assuming fuel efficiency is static and the currents are where the map says they are, and there are no storms, and we can survive 3 more weeks of warp travel. Well, there was a bit more debate after that, but Sarge had made up his mind. He was well and truly done with this shit. There would be no more stops, no more hair-raising escapes with misguided Imperial forces hard on our heels, and no more bloody diplomacy. He could take 3 more weeks, cooped up with the Zoanthrope and fighting off waves of its ghostly minions, as long as at the end he'd be able to dump it both and problem as the crazy astropaths on whichever Inquisitor had ordered the damned bug. This decision met a certain amount of resistance, primarily from Doc, Tink, and the captain, who were tremendously worried about Gravis, the cells, and the very real chance of running out of fuel short of our destination, respectively. Unfortunately, despite how undeniably bad Sarge's plans were, no one besides Nubby thought the other options were any better, and anyway, we were the Guardsman, and Sarge was in command. Once he made his decision, all we could really do was complain and try to figure out how to make his plan work. The captain went off with his subordinates and the navigator to plot our route and informed us that we had 5 hours before the approaching ships forced us to warp. Tink and Jim immediately ran down to the cells and began frantically working with Theo to overhaul all the stuff they'd originally been planning to replace. Sarge, Amy, and Twitch sat down and began harshing out a defensive plan that would take advantage of the Ghostnids' apathy when no one was around to provoke them, and the fact that they didn't ever launch real flanking attacks. Nubby dragged Fumbles off to help him relocate several of his stashes to areas that wouldn't be overrun when the shitstorm resumed. Doc carefully examined Gravis's condition, evaluated his chances of keeping the Marine alive for 3 more weeks of warp travel, spent a while locked in the bathroom alternatively screaming and crying, and then decided that something drastic needed to be done. Doc made his way down to the psyker containment cells, but thankfully didn't go with his first idea, which was to have been just to kill the Zoanthrope and hope Oak and his research buddy would have been in a good mood when they found out. Instead, he poked his nose into a small, currently unused side rooms that had originally been used to hold a captive psyker children, and checked if any of the underside stasis beds had been left over after Tink and Theo had combined a few into one big enough to hold the Zoanthrope. He had a moment of panic when all the cells, except for the one packed with debris, were empty, but when he asked Theo what had happened, the little Xenos explained that they pulled them all out during the project and the leftovers were just in a closet somewhere. Doc knew that the inevitable fate of expensive pieces of equipment that got left in unmonitored closets, so he skipped the scavenger hut and just calmed Nubby to ask which one of his stashes the stasis beds had wound up in. Nubby wasn't keen on to part with his loot, but eventually came around to Doc's way of thinking when the medics started explaining all the horrible things that would happen to him if Gravis died. One of the 5 leftover stasis beds were hauled back up to the medbay, where Doc and Valerie spent several minutes trying to figure out how to fit the upper half of a 3-meter-tall killing machine into a stasis bed sized for children, ages 3 to 12. It was obvious from the start that Gravis's armor and life support machinery wouldn't fit, but it was quickly established that even without those, he would be far too large. In the end, Doc was forced to admit the only way it would work is if they removed Gravis's arms, shoulders, and a good portion of one of his sides. Sister Valerie did not approve this course of action. There was a short argument between Doc and his girlfriend over whether being slowly hacked apart with a diamond-edged bone saw while struggling to fight an alien biotoxin was guaranteed to be fatal or not. Nubby, who tagged along in hopes of getting his loot back, decided to be helpful at this point and suggested that Gravis didn't need to be cut up before going into the bed, as for the stasis field could take care of it for them. He was in the middle of rather gleefully recounting what had happened to a cargo servitor that had been caught half in a field during Tink and Theo's experiments on combining stasis units when Doc realized the obvious solution to the problem. After a few minutes later, Doc was down in the cells screaming at Tink to stop messing around with the psi suppressors and get to work combining the 5 leftover stasis beds into one large enough to hold Gravis. Tink was pretty sure that his current task was a little more important, though, so there was a bit of an argument, and things quickly devolved to a point where Doc was holding a techie up by the collar and shaking him. Jim stepped in at this point, applied a few thousand volts to enforce calmness into Doc's lower back. He explained to the twitching medic that his request had been noted, but building the stasis unit would take a few days and would therefore have to work into the schedule between critical maintenance of the cells. Doc was in no position to argue with Jim or walk away for that matter, so we accepted the Cogboy's promise that it would be the top priority, and got dragged back to the medbay by Nubby and Fumbles. He felt slightly better when Sister Valerie called him a genius, and promised to kiss him later when she wasn't covered with bodily fluids. 2 hours later, we sent our final message to everyone in the system, which was pretty much a detailed list of why they were all idiots and or assholes, and disappeared into the warp before the approaching ships could follow us. All you could really say for the first few days of the warp journey was that they went better than the last few of our previous one. For a starter, our worst case scenario, for conservative values of worst, hadn't come true. The ghost nids just hadn't popped back into existence in the same places they'd been when we dewarped. Our brief stint in normal space had reset their counter or whatever, and the bugs were only appearing in the tainted areas, though at a rate significantly higher than they had before. Spawn rate aside, though, our defensive situation was much better than it had been, and the cells were in pretty good condition too. Thanks to the heroic repair efforts of Tink, Jim, and Theo, the psi suppressors took the strain of entering the warp without failing, and the devices seemed to be functioning better than they had before. There were some concerns about their power output, though, since, as mentioned, the Ghost Nid spawn rate was higher than it had been, and there was also more minor phenomena occurring throughout the ship, as well as increase in the number of IGPs, inexplicable gravis problems. This bothered Tink immensely, since his readings said everything in the cells was working fine, at least for now, and there wasn't any psychic leakage creeping around the cells either. Admittedly, Theo and Jim's psi detectors consisted of the Wraithbone block on a stick and a creepy ornate servo skull that had periodically been fed live rats, but they seemed pretty confident in their readings. Anyway, Tink and the other techies didn't get to ponder the ghost nids for long. Even though the normal space repairs had brought them some breathing room, the lack of replacement parts meant every fix they made was a horrible, time-consuming kludge, and Doc made sure that every minute of their free time was dedicated to putting together Gravis's stasis field. Things were more or less calm for the first 3 days of our efficiently slow warp journey. We kept track of the ghost nids, but didn't waste any time engaging them. Tink and Theo managed to make some serious progress, and Doc managed to stay very positive about the situation while struggling with Gravis's mounting medical problems. The first suppression failure happened on the 4th day. The increase in phenomena and ghost nid spawning was pretty much a repeat of the last time, but the other aspects of the failure went differently. For one, we didn't lose any armsmen on account of how ghost nids still hadn't expended to reach our defensive lines when the failure began. They sure as hell had reached them by the end, though. This time, Fumbles did better as he managed to retain consciousness through the whole thing. Though he was a little loopy afterwards, babbling about something of them being all around and trying to find itself, Gravis, however, came off a lot worse. Doc and Valerie weren't able to figure out what exactly had happened, but the Space Marine's secondary heart wound up resembling a raisin and had to be removed. Once again, the techies managed to fix things, but that marked the end of the easy part of the trip. As the fight against the ghost nids resumed, we realized their spawn rate wasn't the only thing that had gotten worse over time. The bugs were definitely stronger and more aggressive than they had been the last warp trip. They began to exhibit some new and worrying behavior. 3 times in the following 2 days, sizable forces of ghost nids coalesced in areas where they hadn't reached our lines yet, and then slowly wandered into the ship until they ran into our forces. We managed to beef up the defenses in time on all 3 occasions, but they were all difficult fights, and this change in attack patterns forced Sarge, Amy, and the captain to seriously reevaluate their plans. By the 6th day, it was becoming apparent that holding out for 2 more weeks would be close to impossible. The unexpected increase in the ghost nid's strength and their new penchant for the occasional focused attack forced our lines back days ahead of schedule, and the initial ship-wide increase in phenomena we'd seen was getting worse. It was actually beginning to feel like the Geller field was failing, except old Bill was certain that it wasn't, and the usual whispers and blood seepage that had been replaced with far-off chittering sounds and tyrannid ichor. It was obvious the zoanthrope was responsible, but it was still a mystery how, and we couldn't think of anything to do about it besides killing the bug or dewarping. Mind you, dewarping wasn't the same sort of emergency option it had been before. This was because the warp drive took a lot of energy to function, so we didn't actually have enough fuel to get back into the warp if we exited, much less go anywhere or dewarp again afterwards. So if we wanted to bail out of the warp, we were going to need to do it near a system that could provide fuel and handle all the risks that came with that. Still, the situation with the ghost nids was getting bad enough that Sarge was really considering calling for a detour, though the only chance coming up to do so was at least another 3 days of warp current coasting away. So the situation was bad, but there was at least one bright spot thanks to the time freed up by a lucky streak of only minor malfunctions in the cells. Tink and Theo had nearly completed Gravis' stasis field. In fact, they were down to just the last little part, dealing with the power distribution that was proving rather tricky. Since they didn't want to waste time doing it all from scratch, the two of them went down to the cells to take a hard look at how they'd done it last time. That turned out to be a very good decision. Now, despite the zoanthrope being the focus of all this trouble, the three techies didn't actually pay that much attention to it most of the time. For one thing, after Tinks fixed the flickering problem, its stasis field had been working surprisingly well. It was always the devices scattered around the room that needed maintenance. Secondly, the zoanthrope had gotten incredibly creepy after Sarge's slagged hull metal shield had gotten wrapped around its head. It never moved, obviously, but being in stasis and all, but it always felt like it was watching you under the metal. And the longer you looked at it, the worse it got. In retrospect, that was probably what some fancy-pants inquisitory super agent might have called a clue, but we were a little too busy for that shit. We just accepted that the metal-faced Xeno psyker had looked like a cross between a fetus and a snake, and a cockroach was creepy, and we'd felt no need to examine said creepiness for a supernatural element. Anyway, all that this meant was that when Tink crawled under the stasis unit to poke around and asked Theo to watch the field for any flickers, it was actually the first time anyone had really looked that hard at the zoanthrope since we'd re-entered the warp. After a minute or so, Theo asked Tink if he'd touched anything, and when the techie replied with a negative, the little Tau scientist explained that there was some sort of interference pattern inside the field. Tink looked at the focusing array above his head, which looked perfectly intact to him, and asked what the pattern had looked like, and whether it might be yet another psychic phenomenon. Theo walked a circuit around the stasis unit, turned his head from side to side, and then reported. There's actually two focal points positioned right behind the zoanthrope. They're sort of black and smoky and shaped like little wings. So no shit, there we were, in the middle of the warp, too low on fuel to even consider stopping, when we realized that our captive ghost-summoning insectoid Xeno's Psyker was actually a ghost-summoning insectoid Xeno's demon host. I mean, what the hell? Seriously, just how in the name of the Emperor are you supposed to respond to something like that? There's bad situations, and then there's comically bad situations. Anyway, it actually took us a little while to figure out that the zoanthrope was possessed. None of the techies knew much about demons, and the three of them, only Jim had been on the occurrence border during its maiden voyage in an inquisitorial vessel that hadn't actually encountered the demon that had actually possessed the Cogton. So the three of them gawked at the zoanthrope's miniature smoky wings for a while, debated whether it was something that could be ignored, and eventually calmed the rest of us to ask if we had any ideas what was going on. According to the armsman fighting alongside Sarge, his swears were so vitriolic that they actually turned into little insectoid creatures as they left his mouth, and had to be swatted out of the air as they tried to bite people. Given how warpy his section of the line had gotten at this point, none of us really questioned this. Doc burst into hysterical laughter when he heard. This caused a bit of concern among the medical staff, especially the two nurses who'd seen him melting people with Tyranid biotoxin. Sister Valerie carefully relieved him of his scalpel, dosed him with something relaxing but not incapacitating, and took over Graffa's watch while he giggled his way down to the cells to see the wings for himself. After a brief period of mindless panic, Nubby denied all responsibility for what had happened, and then had to explain to those of us who hadn't been there, that this exactly wasn't his fault. Twitch just screamed, "I told you it was demonids!" into his comm bead until Tink muted him. Over the course of the next few hours, everything that had been happening started to make sense. There was some initial confusion about how it was at all possible, since the Xenology Adept kept telling us that demons absolutely could not possess Tyranids. He gave this big lecture on how the hive mind worked, then trotted out that old line that Nids did not have minds or souls, though anyone who's seen a demon engine stomping around a battlefield can tell you neither of those are strictly required. Anyway, the man was absolutely full of shit. I mean, we could all see the wings just sitting there being all smoky and sinister, if a bit on the tiny side. Can't really argue with that. So whether it was a matter of a dozen unimaginable coincidences coming together to make the impossible possible, or if the Emperor had just decided to screw with us, we had the first known case of a possessed Tyranid sitting in the cells. We hoped Oak's research buddy would be happy with it because we weren't going back and getting another one. Where the demon had come from was a little more clear. Back during our first trip on the occurrence border, we'd come down to the psyker containment cells and found them occupied by 5 child psychers in stasis, and a half-pint demon host who wasn't. After we looted a crucial part of the machinery restraining the demon host, as well as 5 non-possessed children, the thing had chased us across the ship. It had looked like a kid with massive wings made of smoke, curly horns, and glowing eyes, at least until we shot its host body to pieces and it ran off to get a new one. The demon host came back a little later as a Narlock with the same wings, and as such, had gotten then tangled up in a fight with a giant demonic servitor titan thing that the tech priest acting ship's Cogton had been constructing for whatever insane reason. That had ended with the Narlock being incorporated into the servitor titan and demon taking over the Cogton. It took some doing, but we eventually destroyed the Servo Narlo Titan, pitched the Cogton into the bridge lift shaft, and cranked the gravity up as high as it would go. That had done for the Cogton, and between reducing its host to a greasy crater and our subsequent exit from the warp, we'd assumed that that was the last we'd seen of the smoked-winged demons as well. The fact that the Cogton's crater could never be repaired even by replacing entire sections of floor and wall, and the way it screamed at people in binary should have tipped us off. So we dismissed the glowing, screaming crater as just another occurrence border thing. Trust me, it doesn't sound stupid until you've been on the ship a while. And got on with our lives. It didn't come to our attention again until we began refurbishing the cells in preparation for the Zoanthrope and had discovered that there was some sort of demonic portal linking the cell that had held the demon's first host to the crater. Once again, we dismissed this as just another phenomenon, and pretty much forgot about it. In retrospect, even though the demonic involvement, it should have occurred to us that having some sort of warp portal inside of all the psi shielding and warp presence shrouding was a very bad thing. Not being demonologists, we had no idea whether the demon had been lurking in the cell or crater all this time, or if it had actually returned from the warp via the places it had tainted. Either way, the presence of a restrained and frequently unconscious psychic being with no emperor or hive mind to protect it must have looked incredibly tasty to it. The demon had probably been slowly corrupting the Zoanthrope ever since we caught it. How does that work with a giant bug anyway? Does the demon tempt it with promises of sugar or something? But we felt fairly certain that Sarge knocking the Zoanthrope out conscious into the tainted cell had been the final straw. After we'd figured out what we were dealing with, as Twitch put it, a demonthrope, as one of the sort of connected to the warp portal which bypassed the psi shielding around the cells to boot, all the stuff with the ghost nids made sense. Well, sort of. We still didn't know what exactly they were, but at least it was clear how they were being called into existence despite the Zoanthrope being contained in the cell. None of us were experts in imprisoning demon hosts, but we were pretty sure it took a bit more than a few psi suppressors and a stasis field to do the job properly. Of course, knowing that you're doing something wrong isn't the same as knowing how to do it right. The Inquisition had always operated under the assumption that demon lore was very need-to-know subject, and in the Inquisition's opinion, a bunch of dumb grunts most certainly did not need to know. Mind you, up until this shit show, we'd agreed with that assessment. None of us had ever imagined that we'd wind up trying to prevent a demonically possessed psychic bug from summoning tides of ethereal Tyranids, or at least not without just killing the damn thing and calling it a day. Anyway, the point is that our team's combined knowledge of demon binding, or whatever you call it, consisted of a suspicion that it probably involved a bunch of runic circles, holy icons, and sinister-looking chains that weren't actually connected to anything load-bearing. The key word of there was suspicion and probably, by the way. So lacking even the slightest idea how to handle the demon directly, we decided to hope like hell that dealing with the source of the problem would somehow fix everything. All of our highly developed problem-solving skills were focused on the demonically tainted cell, and a complex plan of action was formed. Which is to say that we set up a blast shield and tossed half a dozen det packs into it. Of course, the just blow up the demonic portal plan didn't work out, but, it might have worked, and it would have been silly to not check. So after establishing that all we'd managed to do was severely damage the shrine surrounding the Cogton's crater and scare the shit out of a bunch of tech acolytes working on the bridge lift, we moved on to the next low-effort solution. We took one of our 3 spare pieces of psi shielding, crammed it into the doorway of the tainted cell, and then slapped a few dozen prayer seals on it. When that didn't work, we added the 2 other pieces of shielding, and when that didn't work, we finally allowed Fumbles to take a look. That was a nervous 10 minutes, let me tell you. Despite our very well-founded concerns letting the accident-prone Psyker poke at the demonic warp portal, it worked out fine. Mostly because the cyber suppressors kept him from doing anything when he eventually spazzed out. Afterwards, once Fumbles had been woken up and Twitch had stopped abjuring him and throwing holy water around, the Psyker blearily reported that nothing that we were doing actually had any effect on the flow of demonic energy between the tainted cell and the demon throat. However, he was reasonably sure that increasing the distance between the two would at least reduce the flow a bit. Since moving the warp portal wasn't really an option, the only way to accomplish this was moving the demon throat, plus the various pieces of technology which kept it from killing us all. The task of figuring out how to move or more or less relocate the entirety of the cells fell to Tink, who immediately declared it to be impossible. This didn't stop him from calling a council of the nerds, including Old Bill and Hannah, to figure out exactly how impossible it was, though. Tink and his little think tank quickly established that the only system in the cells that could be easily moved was the psi suppression. This was primarily because they'd stopped bothering to bolt the suppressors back down between maintenance cycles, so they were all just taped to the floors and walls. On the other hand, the psi shielding and warp presence shroud, which Fumbles said were hiding the demon throat's location from its ghost nids, were pretty much built into the structure of the cells. Just removing them would require days of cutting, which the ghost nids would probably swarm the cells. Finally, the stasis unit restraining the demon throat was not designed to be moved. Jostling around the focusing array could cause problems ranging from flickers to spontaneous bisection of anything inside the stasis field, and power efficiency hadn't even been considered in its design, so running it off a battery was going to be tricky. The first problem to be solved was that the stasis field, Tink and Fio realized they didn't have to fix everything wrong with the Demon Throat stasis unit, since they had much better ones sitting nearby, nearly finished, just a few rooms away. Their decision to repurpose Gravis' stasis unit got the two of them stabbed by an enraged medic, but luckily they were able to propose a solution for keeping Gravis alive as well. Tink explained from behind an overturned table that there was no reason that the nearly dead Space Marine couldn't just be thrown in the Demon Throat stasis unit after the bug had been relocated. Doc had not been happy with leaving his patient, even in stasis, next to a demonically tainted hole in reality, but eventually agreed and allowed Tink to flee the medbay. The psi shielding and shroud were much trickier problems, and a fair bit of time was spent lamenting the whole mess at the station had ruined our original plans to requisition enough materials to completely rebuild the cells. After a few hours of trying to figure out how to pull everything out and set it back up before a tide of ghost nids killed everyone, the ludicrous proposal of cutting a massive hole through the ship and moving the cells, minus the warpy bit, as one big ol' thingy was put forward. Luckily, Old Bill saved us all from that retarded plan when he decided to take a second look at the list of parts that would need to be moved. Consummate scrounger that was Old Bill would typically suggest 5 different alternatives for any missing critical part, and he was better than a savant when it came to keeping track of what had been used where and whether it would be missed. His abilities had let him down a little bit when it came to the highly specialized systems in the cells, but they came to our rescue in a big way when he asked whether a psi shield panel was anything like a psi focusing panel. After some debate, Tink pointed out that it was all moot since there weren't any psi focusing panels in the inventory. Old Bill asked whether anyone thought our headless astropath still needed the ones lining his sanctum. One quick check of the dried brains splattered sanctum later, it was established that the panels which focused incoming astropathic messages to the chair in the middle of the sanctum could indeed be repurposed as shields. Theo, who'd become the resident expert on the underlying theory of most of the systems in the cells, claimed it was just a matter of tweaking the machinery that aligned the crystal matrices in each panel and began estimating how long it would take to move them all the bay that had been picked for the new cells. Tink asked why the hell we should bother moving them. The decision to just repurpose the Occurrence Border's bridge-adjacent astropathic sanctum as a demonthrope holding area was reached quickly by Tink and his fellow nerds. It took a little more time and a lot more shouting from Sarge, the captain, and the navigator, whose sanctum was next door, to come around that time was used to tackle the final problem, the Warp Presence Shroud. The Shroud was a device which hid the warp presence of anyone inside from those outside. Such devices were typically used to hide vulnerable psychers from hungry demons during warp travel, but they were also great for hiding from psychers. Since the Occurrence Border had been smuggling child psychers, a practice which the Inquisition sort of frowned upon, the cells had a very good shroud, though it hadn't done jack shit to hide the zoanthrope from the demon that had been lurking inside the radius. Anyway, this well-made shroud consisted of a fair-sized pile of arcane machinery which was, unfortunately, hooked to some sort of projector matrix embedded in the psi shields. Once again, it seemed like the days of disassembling while fighting off a ghost Nid onslaught would be needed. But Theo had a better idea. The little Tau scientist claimed that the block of Wraithbone he'd been playing with for the last few weeks had some interesting anti-warp properties, and he was 72.361% sure that he could be used to build something that would work like a shroud. It was a mark of everyone's exhaustion that the annoying little Xenos idea was accepted without argument. So roughly 26 sleepless hours after our discovery of the zoanthrope's wings, we designed a new cell to contain it. 30 hours of hard work and heroic ghost tyrannid fighting after that, the new cell was complete, and all that was left to do was transport the barely restrained Xenos demon host through a ship filled with ravenous insectoid warp ghosts it had called into existence. When Tink said that everything was ready, all of us plus Theo and Gravis's mobile medical monstrosity gathered in the cells. During the prior few days, we'd managed to hold off ghost nids and keep the Space Marine alive despite a steady increase in the Demonthrope's power over the ship and the irreparable failure of one of the psi suppressors. During the little free time we'd had, a route had been plotted from the cells up through the lower decks to the bridge lift and finally the sanctum. The corridors were cleared of impediments, all the armsmen that could be spared from the main lines were stationed at checkpoints along the route, and the new stasis unit had been mounted on a motorized cargo pallet. When the last of the preparations were finished, Sarge alerted the captain, who sent out a ship-wide warning, and we got ready for the most hectic prisoner transfer of our lives. The first step of a transfer was moving the Demonthrope from its old stasis unit to the new mobile one. There's probably a whole chapter on this sort of thing in whatever the inquisitorial equivalent of the uplifting primer is. You're probably supposed to use all sorts of seals, powerful psychers, and some of that special tyrannid tranquilizer the sides had. We made do with just a few ropes, a ramp made out of a wall panel that no one would miss, and a cargo net. Tink lined up his long-distance manipulation tool, see poking stick, on the stasis unit's off button, then jabbed it and dove for cover. As the stasis field vanished, a pair of deep red spots appeared on the Demonthrope's metal-covered face, and its stubby little smoke wings suddenly expanded to a full meter in length. A horrible, soundless screech echoed through the cells. Thousands of insects began pouring out of every crack and crevice, and a corona of black-edged green lightning formed around the Demonthrope. Then the cargo net yanked it off its grab plates and dragged it face first down the corrugated metal ramp. The Demonthrope flailed around a little, but didn't have enough strength to offset the manly, and womanly, muscle of the 4 Guardsmen. We dragged it screeching and kicking up sparks into the waiting stasis unit, and Theo turned on the field. The insects around the room vanished into little puffs of black and green smoke, but a faint echo of the psychic screeching still lingered, and the spots where the Demonthrope's expanded wings met the edge of the stasis field smoked in an ominous way. Sarge decided that this shit was too eldritch for his liking, yelled at Tink, Theo, and Doc to move their asses. Doc was in a better bit of a panic on account of how insects had been crawling out of Gravis's torso wound during the Demonthrope transfer, and the fact that every life support system hooked up to the Marine was screaming for attention. He dithered around trying to figure out what to treat first until Sarge resolved things by hefting Gravis off the life support bed. Doc tried and failed to keep everything connected as the torso-fied space marine was hauled across the room and then just gave up and helped Sarge. Gravis started to spasm and spurt all sorts of disgusting fluids as he was pushed into the bubble of null G in the middle of the stasis unit, prompting Doc to panic and hit the on button a little early. He apologized profusely as a bandaged Sarge, slightly shorter finger, and sprayed disinfectant over everything Gravis had dribbled on. While Gravis was moved, Tink and Theo ran around directing us and their drones in the process of moving the psi suppressors. Extensions were spliced into the power cords on either side of the hacked-together Tau Imperial hybrid devices, and a jumbled circle of arcane machinery was formed around the Demonthrope's stasis pallet. Then, piece by piece, each of the psi suppressors was fastened to the pallet until it bristled with various engines, antennas, crystals, and less identifiable pieces of tech. When all the suppressors were fastened down and connected to the large battery array mounted on the front of the pallet, and Gravis was safe-ish in the Demonthrope's old stasis unit, we were pretty sure that his expression of painful and horror wasn't anything to worry about. We readied our weapons and got ready for the hard part. Sarge sent a final warning to the captain and counted down. As Sarge reached 0, Spot 2.0 opened the outer door to the cells, and all across the ship, the Tyranid Warp Ghost paused in their pursuit of repositioning armsmen, turned to focus on us, and solidified. We came out of the cells at a dead sprint, or at least those of us on foot did. Theo was perched in a semi-clear spot on the pallet behind the Demonthrope, gibbering as his drones in drones in Tau speak, and doing his best to keep everything from spontaneously exploding. Tink had a similar spot on battery pack and was splitting his attention between steering the pallet and scouting ahead with Spot. Twitch and Sarge were on point, pulling ahead to cover each corner of the doorway, and Amy and Doc were keeping an eye on our flanks from the middle of the group. Finally, Nubby was squeezed into a crevice at the back of the pallet, where he was simultaneously able to cover our rear and avoid doing any running. To our immense relief, we made it to the end of this corridor without the Demonthrope doing anything warpy or a swarm of ghost nids just appearing around us. Tink and Theo had said that leaving the cells wouldn't suddenly grant the Demonthrope more power, but the rest of us hadn't been so sure. Anyway, after the first straightaway, we began winding through the area around the cells in a manner that could be described as drunken, despite all appearances though it really was the fastest route available. Due to the chaotic layout of the occurrence border, the size of the pallet, and the amount of the ship occupied by ghost nids, the path that we'd mapped out to the sanctum was anything but direct. The first leg involved a winding path around the cells area which took us dangerously close to ghost nid-infected territory before depositing us at one of the few major tilt corridors still under our control. We ran as fast as we could through the connecting corridors, across recently cleared storage bays, and up the occasional microlift, ignoring the various minor phenomena, maddening whispers, and occasionally uncleared technical hazards. Our progress was surprisingly good, possibly because we were lent an extra motivation by what sounded like every ghost nid on the ship baying for our blood, but it wasn't enough to keep us ahead of the entirety of the swarm. The first pack of ghost nids clawed its way out of an oversized air vent behind us as we exited a short in-bay lift. Luckily, that first pack hadn't included any ghostly termagants or higher forms. It was just a bunch of hormagants and rippers, though they were significantly more solid than any we'd encountered during the previous weeks. Solidity aside, we knew how to deal with a bunch of melee hostiles coming up a coverless corridor. Nubby began picking off the lead bugs with pulse fire, while Twitch dug through his detonators, and the rest of us kept moving. As the bulk of the pack passed their way into a yellow X mark on the corridor wall behind us, Twitch found the right detonator and set off the two of the frag mines he'd lined up the corridor with. Doc and Amy paused for a second to help Nubby mop up the stragglers, and then everyone returned to their positions, and our fight continued, without the pallet ever losing any speed. As the last of us left the corridor, Twitch armed the rest of his mines, and a minute later, we heard them start going off. Variations of that little scuffle were repeated a dozen times as we escorted the Demonthrope towards the checkpoint at the start of the tilt corridor. The ghost nids were harder to kill than any we'd encountered during the previous weeks. They just took as much killing as real Tyranids, despite the fact they poofed away into smoke when they finally died. On the bright side, the bugs' new solidarity seemed to have robbed them of their ability to move through walls, though they made up for it with a freakish ability to home in on us. Wave after wave of the bugs came up behind our little convoy, as well as through the vents in the walls and ceilings, and eventually from ahead of us as our course turned back towards the Ghostnid territory. The continuous attack slowed us down a little, but didn't pose a serious threat. They were just gaunts and rippers after all, and we were bloody Imperial Guardsmen. Mowing down endless waves of underarmed Xenos with superior firepower is what Emperor made us for. Between Twitch's mines, the early warnings and target markings from Spot the Wonder Drone, and a giant pile of pulse ammo we brought along, we dropped most of the NIDs the second we saw them. Of course, that's not to say that everything went our way. Either the Demonthrope was exhibiting some serious power besides its stasis state, or the Occurrence Border's warpy little machine spirit had a really twisted sense of humor. On 4 occasions during our twisty run towards the checkpoint, at the bottom of the tilt corridor, we ran into a phenomena that seemed specifically designed to either slow us down or assist the Ghostnids in killing us. 2 of the delays were frustrating, but non-lethal in and of themselves. Twice, immediately after Spot had flown through a doorway, it slammed shut and reopened an all too familiar giant room filled with fire. When we reached it ourselves. The first time it happened, Twitch led us down a winding detour which had involved several Ghostnid attacks in tight corners. The second time, Tink just plasmaed us a new door to the next fiery one. The Demonthrope, or maybe just our terrible luck, struck again at the midway point of our first leg of our journey, when we all simultaneously ran out of breath and were deafened by a shrill and chittering keening sound. It wouldn't have been that much of a problem, except for the fact that it coincided with attacks from our front and rear by waves of gaunts. The sudden slowdown and the inability to communicate might have been lethal for our exposed pointmen. If it hadn't been the rest of us, it had been on our toes. Doc and Amy, operating completely independently, both tossed frags at the pursuing swarm and grabbed a hold of the motorized pallet right as Tink floored it, and Nubby took care of the stragglers. They arrived just a little too late to prevent the frontal attacks from reaching Sarge and Twitch, but Sarge was a big boy who could handle a few scrapes and scratches, and Twitch had just hidden behind the beefy non-com until relief arrived. The final serious phenomena occurred only 2 rooms from the checkpoint, and very nearly got us all killed. We were crossing a storage bay that apparently held tanks of drinking water, headlight fluid, pressurized liquid chlorine, and toothpaste, when a pack of Ghostnids clawed a hole through a doorway on Amy's flank. As she started picking the bugs off, a sort of howling spectral gale manifested in the corridor behind the bugs, and 3 of them were propelled through the hole like angry insectoid cannonballs. 1 gaunt was shot out of the air, another pancaked against the toothpaste tank, and a 3rd landed on Amy. Amy's panic snapshot missed the gaunt, passed a centimeter in front of Theo's face, and exploded one of the crystal-tipped suppression pylons mounted on the Demonthrope's pallet. The lights abruptly went out, frost began to form along the walls, and the bay's Vox system began screaming at us in a mix of Jantine battle cant and HUD. All of us, except Amy, who was trying to keep the gaunt from eating her face, and Nubby, who helpfully shot it off her, activated our tack lights and scanned the room for any sort of new warpy threat, while Theo tried to repair the suppressor, and Tink kept the pallet moving. Our rubbernecking was brought to an abrupt halt by 3 sudden realizations. Firstly, that the Ghostnid on top of Amy was reforming instead of dissipating into smoke. Secondly, the screaming Vox was just a leakage alarm as opposed to some sort of warp phenomenon. And finally, that Amy's shot had terminated in the pressurized chlorine tank. Amy practically teleported out from under the reforming gaunt, which Nubby shot a few more times for good measure, and we bailed out of the bay as fast as we could, literally stampeding the NIDs coming at us from ahead. As we exited, Doc attempted to close the bay behind us, only to find a little yellow note apologizing for scrounging the door's control panel. He settled for tossing a nade in, and now reformed Gaunt and the other NIDs that were moving through the gas with impunity. We hit the tilt corridor checkpoint at a dead sprint, with the ghost NIDs and gas hard on our heels. It took the armsmen defending the barricade-packed 4-way junction a few seconds to register our presence, which was understandable given the way the bugs were holding off had started reforming as we approached. When the sergeant-at-arms leading the group finally realized we were there, he nearly put a round in the Demonthrope out of sheer reflex, but Sarge caught him in time and started belting out orders. Our initial plan had been to take a breather, restock on ammo, and swap out the pallet's batteries for the ones we'd stashed here. but the reforming NIDS and inexorably approaching gas cloud meant that there wasn't time. Each of us grabbed what we could in the 10 seconds it took Sarge to order the armsman to get ready to bail, preferably to somewhere airtight, and Tink coupled the pallet to the cart thing, waiting for the edge of the tilt corridor. Theo, still busy with trying to fix the psi suppressor Amy had shot, screamed at the tech acolyte holding the replacement batteries to just hop on the cart and followed the terrified cogboy aboard. After an entire 30 seconds after our arrival, the armsman manning the barricades beat feet. By the 40-second mark, a mix of chlorine gas and warp-spawned Tyranids had filled the checkpoint. 10 seconds after that, the det pack Twitch had left in the pile of leftover ammo turned the whole place into a gas and gore-filled crater. We would have stopped to high-five each other, but we were a little too busy holding on for dear life as we raced down, or up, depending how you looked at it, the tilt corridor. Now, those of you who haven't been aboard a ship as cludged together as the occurrence border might be wondering what tilt corridors are. According to Old Bill, they were grav lifts, shafts with angled grav plates so you could just walk up them like a corridor instead of waiting for a lift, from back before his time when the occurrence border still had an organized ship-wide gravitic field. At some point during the transition to the current ad hoc system, either some of Titanic accident or hard work on one of his predecessors had twisted all 4 shafts into massive ramps which paradoxically pulled upwards. The end result was that inside the tilt corridors, going up ship, as we wanted to do, was downhill, and pretty steep downhill at that. So picture a 300-meter long slide with a 6-person cargo cart on the top. Now add 6 guardsmen, a Tau scientist, and a terrified tech acolyte, and a demonthrope-laden pallet. Finally, put a cargo bay and a 90-degree gravity shift at the bottom, and give the whole thing a push. It was pretty high on the list of the stupidest ways we'd ever traveled, or at the top of it if you lumped in the traversing the warp in a glorified Space Hulk, but at least Spot was there to record the terrifying amount of air we got as we reached the bottom of the corridor and shot out of the bay. Now when I say terrifying amount of air, I mean terrifying. The only reason we didn't hit the 10-meter high ceiling of the cargo bay was because of the cluster of ghostly gaunts we hit first. We exploded into the bay in a shower of chitin and ichor, sailed over a barricaded group of armsmen, passed just under a massive light fixture, came down on another cluster of ghost nids, and skidded to a juicy halt in front of the armsmen protecting the doors to the aft cargo lift. The armsmen stared at us, we stared back, and the elderly engineer fiddling with the doors yelled at everyone to keep it down while he worked. Being uncomfortably aware of the way the Tyranid grew that we had landed in was reforming, we didn't waste any time sitting around boggling at the fact that we were still alive. The cargo cart was ditched, and we squoze past the armsman to the lift door, where the white-haired engineer informed us that it wasn't quite ready yet. Sarge drew a breath and got ready to scream at the old geezer about our impending deaths at the claws of a swarm of reanimating warp bugs, but deflated when Tink, who knew the engineer, quietly explained that it would only result in a lecture about young people and their myriad of failings. Left with a lot of unspent rage, Sarge began pouring pulse fire into the surrounding ghost nids and yelled at us to get off our asses and do the same. We all stepped up to help Sarge and the armsmen play whack-a-bug, except for the few of us that had very useful things to do. Tink jumped off his driver's seat on the pallet and grabbed the replacement batteries from the practically catatonic tech acolyte and began replacing the nearly expended ones powering the Demonthrope stasis unit and the suppressors. Doc attempted to patch the defensive wound that Amy had acquired when the Gaunt had landed on her, but got told to go fondle someone else who didn't have shooting to do, and switched his attention to the badly wounded armsman. Theo had the small Tauish device he'd been fiddling with up to the busted suppressor and declared his genius as the dead bugs around us stopped reforming and began to drift apart. The armsman cheered as the ghost knit advance slowed, and so did we when the engineer whacked the door control a few times with a spanner and it began to grind open. No one noticed when one of the tendrils of smoke rising from where the Demonthrope's wing intersected the stasis field twisted towards the Vox system set in the bay's ceiling. At least not until the Vox began screeching in a high-pitched, chittering sound. Now, an uneducated plebeian might have mistaken the sound coming from the Vox for mindless Tyranid chittering, but we immediately identified it as binary, and an attempt by the Demonthrope to control any nearby servitors, servo-skulls, and cogboys. A Guardsman's senses are just that precise. Well, no, actually they aren't, but it was a sort of obvious after the tech acolyte smashed the psi suppressor Theo had just fixed. As usual, Twitch was the first to respond, even if he was actually operating under the assumption that the Mechanicus had been aligned with the Demonids, or possibly the Orcs, all along. And this was just the first stage of their uprising against the divine light of the Emperor. Luckily, we sorted that out for him before he ran into Jim or Hannah again, and even more luckily, for the tech acolyte at least, Twitch couldn't get a line of sight past our panicking Tau scientist, so instead of blowing off the hapless tech acolyte's head, Twitch opened fire on the engineer's 2 servo skulls, taking them down before they could do any damage to the pallet. The engineer responded by throwing his spanner at Twitch, but it only bounced off his helmet, and the man apologized later, so there were no hard feelings. The rest of us took a little longer than Twitch to react, which meant that the tech acolyte had time to damage another psi suppressor before Tink brained him with a battery. As the second suppressor failed, a shipquake shook the bay, and the dead ghostnids stopped dissipating and began to flow together into large piles. When the first Tyranid warrior emerged from the goo and began hosing the barricades with death spitter rounds, we decided that it was really time that we got moving again and sprinted for the open lift. Actually, it wasn't as unanimous a decision as most of our retreats were. Doc had become rather fixated on the armsman he was treating and wound up dragging the partially disemboweled man along with us into the lift. Also, as we ran by the half-conscious acolyte, Twitch raised the possibility of continued demonthropic position and lift sabotage, and suggested that blowing the cogboy's head off was the only way to be sure. Nubby ended the ethical debate before it started by kicking the tech priest acolyte into the floor hatch the engine seer had opened as an escape route for himself and the armsman. Judging by the crashes and bangs, the maintenance shaft went down 3 or 4 levels, but cogboys tend to be fairly sturdy, and he looked fine when we saw him again a few weeks later. Though possibly that had been some other tech acolyte who was terrified of us and had an impressive collection of ladder-rung-shaped dents. Once aboard the lift, we shut the door on the deteriorating situation in the cargo bay and began our slow ascent to the main cargo corridor. Our ride was accompanied by the sound of thousands of ghostnid clawing at the shaft's doors, and this was made even worse by the mixture of cheery music and demonic screeches playing over the lift's speakers. Those of us who weren't attempting to save arbitrarily acquired armsmen, repair the damaged suppressors, or calm the cogitator adept for a sit-rep scanned the shaft above us and tried to anticipate where the first breakthrough would occur. It was a very high-stress situation, especially after Sarge learned that the checkpoint at the top of the lift was under heavy attack, which is why several of us reflexively started shooting the walls when the lift suddenly stopped and the lights went out. There were a few seconds of wild panic, and then Tink and Theo got the wide-angle illuminators on their drones activated, and we realized a few things. Firstly, the sound of angry Tyranids clawing at the shaft had vanished, as had the reassuring background noise of our comm beads and the humming buzz of the overloaded psi suppressors, but not the annoying lift music. Secondly, the shaft walls were bleeding, and it was human blood instead of Tyranid ichor for a change. Also, the tormented-looking faces that occasionally pressed out of the gore, then faded again, didn't look insectoid either. Finally, and most worryingly to those of us who knew the occurrence border's foibles, the level we'd stalled at didn't have a big cargo bay-sized door, just an ordinary-looking hatch. Oh, and Doc's armsman was dead, but that probably had more to do with the cantaloupe-sized hole in his gut than anything eldritch. Theo, after verifying that the psi suppressors were still functioning, just not being overloaded for a change, jumped at the chance to do some repairs and completely ignored the totally normal-looking door. The rest of us gathered around it and held completely silent debate, which ended with our fearless leader stepping forward to open it while we got ready to blow apart whatever horrors waited on the other side. As the door swung open, we all lowered our weapons. Twitch whimpered, Amy and Doc swore. Tink set spot to record, Sarge facepalmed, and Nubby cheerily waved at the smoldering, bearded skeleton at the head of the poker table, who laughed and waved back. Our arrival didn't go unnoticed by the other players at the poker table. The charred skeleton with a chainsword at his side turned and waved as well, and the exit wound-faced man on the far side raised his beard to us before messily dumping it into the approximate area where his mouth had once been. This caught the attention of the last man at the table, a massive, angry-looking fellow in scout armor who looked surprisingly normal if you ignored the telephone pole-sized tyrannid talon lodged in his chest. He turned towards the door, knocking drinks and chips everywhere with his chest talon, then went wide-eyed as he saw us. The man immediately leapt to his feet and began striding towards the door while ranting about cowards, scavengers, and heretics. We automatically raised our weapons again, but before the ranting scout marine got much closer, the sword-bearing skeleton and nearly headless guardsman shared an exasperated look, got up, grabbed him by the elbows. They didn't actually have enough strength to stop the scout, but the bearded skeleton man came over and pulled down on the talon sticking out of the large man's back, causing him to topple backwards. The scout marine was dragged back to the table, screaming at us the whole way, mostly about his sergeant, specifically how our incompetence had gotten him cut in half, the way he'd lost, stolen, or sold most of his gear, his legs, and how finally left him alone and dying in a demonically tainted hole. This annoyed Doc, who thought he'd done a pretty good job keeping Gravis sort of alive, all things considered, and as such he said so. On the list of sane things to do, arguing with a dead scout marine is pretty close to the bottom, but that didn't stop Doc, or Nubby, and Tink for that matter. All three of them started throwing excuses, explanations, and insults at the impaled scout, who expanded his list of grievances to include being too cowardly or stupid to shoot down a flyrant, abandoning a shuttle full of his battle brothers in a Xenos-filled backwater, and getting him stuck in some shitty poker room for all eternity. Nubby responded by calling his Primarch fat. The bearded skeleton, who'd been snickering at the exchange, and Sarge's pained reaction to it, fell over laughing at that remark, and the argument petered out. Once again, he'd regained his breath. The skeleton apologized for the new guy's complete lack of perspective, and then immediately went on to congratulate us for doing something about Frank, since he gestured towards our pallet. When he said that, we assumed he meant the demonthrope, and didn't ask why it had a name. Sarge adopted his best poker face, thanked the skeleton for his praise, suggested that it was time that we got moving again, and began to shut the door. The bearded skeleton held up a finger and suggested we take the lift all the way up to level 39. Tink, ever the pendant, pointed out that the lift only went to level 26.5, which prompted yet another bout of knee-slapping laughter from the skeleton. Acting as if we'd just said the most hilariously stupid thing he'd ever heard, the bearded skeleton repeated Tink's statement to his three companions, two of which joined him in laughing. After a few seconds, the faceless guardsman gurgled something which prompted the spokes skeleton to make a "get a load of this guy" gesture at him and asked us if we minded. Without even thinking, Sarge responded with a shrug, then flinched backwards as the headshot corpse suddenly appeared at the doorway and began to lean into the lift. Talking to the familiar denizens of the poker room was one thing, but one of them coming out was quite another. Most of us raised our weapons and Sarge tried to slam the door, but Twitch grabbed his arm and gestured at the rest of us to put the guns away and back up. The nearly headless guardsman gave Twitch an appreciative-sounding gurgle and reached an arm out towards the lift control panel. As the corpse's arm passed over the threshold, its flesh on it began to rot and bubble, and the lights on the drones and our armor began to flicker. With a crackling pop, the annoying lift music cut out and was replaced by immensely creepy children's songs, which the blood faces on the shaft's wall began singing to. Twitch began rocking back and forth and singing along as well, and for some reason Theo joined in too. Amy told them to both stop being crazy, prompting Twitch to start giggling, and Theo to complain about how he was just trying to fit in, and we really needed to document what was and wasn't considered crazy in our backwards culture. When its rotting arm reached the control panel, the headshot guardsman began leaning his head out to get a look at what he was doing. We all reflexively looked away and didn't see exactly what happened next, but there was an indescribably foul smell and a layer of frost formed on everything in the lift except for the demonthrope's stasis unit. Then the frost and the smell abruptly vanished, and the singing stopped, and we looked back to see the guardsman lumbering back into a poker room, looking as normal as anyone with a massive crater in their head can. The charred, spoked skeleton laughed at us, gestured towards the button labeled 39 that had appeared at the top of the control panel, and asked if that was better, and told us to have fun. Behind him, the sword-bearing skeleton paused from restraining the scout and waved, then told us not to fuck up, because they had money on us. The last thing we saw before Sarge closed the door was the two skeletons levering the scout up and the headshot guardsman sitting down at the bar next to a vague, ghostly-shaped shape that hadn't been there earlier. We noted the absence of Doc's recently expired armsman and unanimously agreed to never speak of him again. When the door was firmly shut, we all stood around waiting to see if anything else was going to happen. After a few seconds, Nubby cheerily announced that went all right, clumped over to the lift control panel and pressed the new button before anyone could think to stop him. All of us swore at the little trooper as the lift launched upwards like a rocket booster that had been attached to it, and a sensation disturbingly similar to a bad warp transit rolled over us. It took us about 8 seconds for the lift to reach level 39. This was admittedly a great improvement over its usual speed, but that didn't quite make up for the general unpleasantness of the ascent and the way we were all launched a meter into the air when it slammed to a stop. We staggered to our feet, attempted to look around, and realized that we were somehow unable to direct our gaze at anything but the floor and the wall in front of us. The lift, which held yet another door that didn't belong in a lift shaft. Nubby scampered towards the lift control panel, only to find himself suspended in the air by his collar. Sarge handed him to Amy, walked over to the panel, and briefly perused the options before giving up and just hitting the open door button. It slid to reveal a short, unlit hallway that was just large enough for the pallet, and another door. Lacking any better ideas, we entered the hallway and were totally unsurprised when the door slammed shut behind us. What did surprise us were the words, "Outer airlock door," for real this time, stenciled on its inside. Tink spoke for all of us when he suggested getting through the inner door as fast as possible. On the far side of the door, we found a bunk room full of confused crewmen. When asked, they confirmed that they were indeed on level 39 and only a short distance away from the main lift. Sarge reported our position to the Cogitator Adept, who presumably relayed it to everyone else while we resumed our journey to the Astropathic Sanctum. Our pace was much slower than it had been before, partially because we didn't have a pre-mapped route anymore, but mostly because there were no ghost nids up there to attack us. Also, it seemed like Theo had done a great job of repairing the psi suppressors. They were nearly silent, and nothing weird was happening at all. We practically strolled through bays and corridors, congratulating ourselves and praising the generosity of the overcooked skeletons as we walked. This light mood lasted until we reached the entrance to the main lift. As the door opened to reveal the lift shaft, the tendrils of smoke drifting from the Demon Throp's wings suddenly snaked around and shot downwards. 13 levels below us, the tendrils pooled against the roof of the shrine that had been built over the Cogton's crater, and then melted through it in a burst of black and green light. A screeching that sounded like a cross between binary, tyrannid, and demonic echoed up the shaft, and everything, very abruptly, went to shit. The psi suppressors began making an overloaded whine, and the two that Theo had just repaired exploded. Fragments of metal and crystal bounced off our carapace armor and Spot's tau metal chassis. But Theo and the delicate machinery on the pallet weren't anywhere near as protected. The little Xenos received several nasty gashes on his face and arms. 2 more suppressors began spewing out clouds of smoke, and the stasis unit began emitting a steadily rising whine that was all horribly familiar to us. Down in the shaft, several things that sounded bigger and warpier than any ghost nid we'd ever encountered began to howl. Now, despite occasional bouts of irrationality and insanity, we were a bunch of semi-professional badasses. So we didn't just stand around panicking over how screwed we were. Within 5 seconds of the suppression failure, we all had 4 guns pointing pulse fire into the indistinct forms crawling up the lift shaft, and Doc and Tink were seeing to Theo and the damaged pallet. Doc immediately diagnosed Theo's injuries as non-life-threatening, administered a few bandages and tau-safe painkillers, then steered the little Xenos over to where Tink was doing his best to keep anything else from exploding. The top priority was the stasis unit, which was making the telltale sound of an imminent flicker. Given that this unit didn't have an array of grav plates to keep anything inside from escaping, Tink was operating under the assumption that any flicker over a second long would result in an enraged Xenos demon host flying into the air and tearing us all to bloody pieces. He and Theo, who was badly shaken but still able to help, set to work stabilizing, splicing, and other technical shit, while Doc ran over to join the rest of us in our delightful game of shoot the horrible monster before it closes to melee range and kills you. Horrible monster was really the best description he could come up with for what was climbing up the shaft around the rising lift platform. By the time Doc had arrived, we'd killed at least 6 of them between us. That's 3 for Amy, the show-off, and 1 each for everyone else. But we still had no idea what the hell these things were. We could see tyrannid chitin and claws, but they were mixed in with tentacles and massive bulging eyes, and the whole mess seemed to be covered with clouds of obscuring smoke, which Twitch would up triumphantly, declaring them to be the long-predicted demonids, but none of us bothered to argue with him. Unlike most of our battles with the ghost nids, our defense of the level 39 lift door, not a battle name for the history books like that, wasn't a cakewalk. Whatever these things climbing up the shaft were, they could take an awful lot of fire, and they moved there far faster than anything their size had any right to. We operated as efficiently as possible, calling targets, maintaining fire discipline, and making heavy use of Spot's marker thingy, but they steadily gained ground on us, especially where the rising lift platform, a half-shaft wall crawler, picture a metal rectangle with massive gears on 3 sides, blocked our line of sight. To make things worse, the demonthrope was acting all sorts of uppity. Tink and Theo managed to prevent a stasis flicker, thank the Emperor, but the damn bug was still able to inflict all sort of inconvenient minor phenomenon on us, and we could feel it trying to worm its way into our minds. Presumably it was trying to command us to do its bidding, but unlike the demons we'd heard about from other inquisitorial agents, this thing apparently only knew how to speak in binary and tyrannid, so it mostly just incoherent psychically screeched at us. But it was still very distracting, and left us all with massive headaches, plus a vague minor hunger for human flesh and motor oil. So it was pretty obvious to all of us that our situation wasn't sustainable, but luckily it didn't have to be. We really only had to hold out long enough for the lift to reach us, and for us to ride it up to the bridge level, where it was a short sprint to the former astropathic sanctum. Not an easy task by any means, but one that was a definite possibility. Well, at least we hoped it was possible, because the only other option was setting off the failsafe Twitch had wired to the demonthrope stasis unit, and it would really suck if we wound up just killing the thing after hauling it halfway across the galaxy. It took an absolutely grueling 3 minutes for the lift to clank its way up to us, but we managed to hold off the demonids, or whatever, until it reached us. We piled aboard and switched to a much less efficient omnidirectional defense of the edges of the platform, which we immediately realized was not going to be enough to keep them from catching us before we reached the bridge. Not liking the idea of fighting 3-meter-tall monsters as they climbed over the edge of the platform and directly into melee range, Sarge ordered the deployment of our remaining grenades and as many of Twitch's det packs as he could use without collapsing a wall. The wave of explosions that rolled down the shaft was like a miniature artillery barrage. It was immensely satisfying to watch bug after bug being knocked off of the walls to plummet to the bottom of the shaft. The distant sound of their enraged howls ending in gooey, crackling crashes warmed our hearts, but not as much as what we saw when the smoke cleared. The massed concussive force and impacts of their falling companions had dislodged almost every one of the climbing demonids. We began picking off the last stragglers, and for a few seconds actually thought we'd bought enough time to reach our destination unmolested. Then the tendrils of smoke drifting down from the demonthrope twisted into a giant pile of ichor and limbs at the bottom of the shaft, and something freaking massive pulled itself together. It rose out of the goo, turned a horned head towards us, and spread its wings that touched the edge of the shaft. The 5 of us looking over the edge swore, as what looked for all the world like a winged hive tyrant with extra eyes and tentacles launched itself upward. We all immediately opened fire on full auto, just indiscriminately hosing the demonic flyrant as much as pulse fire as we could possibly gather, which accomplished very little aside from making it angry. It was hard to tell whether the thing was shrugging off our fire or regenerating its injuries, but in the end the result was the same, and Sarge quickly ordered us to change our tactics. Tink ran over and joined us, nailing the Flyrant with big old balls of armor-piercing plasma, while the rest of us focused our fire on Spot's marker light. Our target was the thing's wing, specifically the joint where the left one connected to its shoulder, which we figured would be a rather delicate and vulnerable spot in the Flyrant's armor. This proved true. Unfortunately, the result when we finally burned through it was disappointing. The wing did shear off and drop down the shaft, but the Flyrant didn't follow it down. The demon thrope's smoky tendrils coalesced around the bloody joint, and then sprang out to form a new wing before the beast had fallen more than a meter. With what was undoubtedly a laugh, the Flyrant resumed its flight. We were understandably frustrated by this development, but ultimately not defeated. We shot the smoky wing a little bit too to see if that would work, and when it didn't, we shifted our fire to the other wing, mostly out of stubbornness. Once that wing had reformed out of smoke too, and the Flyrant had let out another horrible demonic laugh, we began directing our fire at what little we could see of its head. Well, most of us did. Nubby and Twitch decided that the Emperor could worry about the structural integrity of the lift shaft and began unloading the Demolition Trooper's pack. The first det pack pegged the Flyrant on the tip of its pointy head and knocked it half a meter downwards when it detonated, but didn't do more than blacken and crack the thing's chitinous armor. Before those cracks could heal, though, a second det pack exploded in the air just behind it, damaging it further and temporarily disrupting the solidity of its wings. Now, if Twitch hadn't been running low on munitions, it sounds impossible, I know, but several weeks of constant fighting was enough to run down even his stockpiles. This renewed explosive assault might have been enough to stop the Flyrant. Unfortunately, he and Nubby ran out of det packs far before the giant demonic bug ran out of whatever kept it alive. That didn't mean Twitch was out of explosives, though, just the ones that he could easily be used against the moving target. When the Flyrant came through the 9th det pack explosion, looking as pissed as ever, he instructed Nubby to grab a few parts from Tink and Theo and began messing with the mixed assortment of mines he had left. Of course, the rest of us weren't just standing around while this was going on, but we kept putting fire into the Flyrant's head and shoulders. We just had no idea if it was actually going to accomplish anything. By our reckoning, we'd done far more damage than it would taken to kill the non-demonic Flyrant that had bisected Sergeant Gravis, but even the gaping holes left by Tink's weapon seemed to be filling, almost as fast as we inflicted them. Nubby quickly acquired the parts Twitch wanted, then ran around collecting everyone's leftover flash and smoke grenades. Mind you, he didn't bother to ask us for them. The little klepto just sort of drifted around like a rancid breeze, and they were gone. Anyway, everything, even vaguely explosive, was loaded into Twitch's pack, and the makeshift detonator was rigged, and the improvised bomb was placed at the edge of the lift, where Tink threw a sizable wrench into the plan by refusing to attach the bomb to Spot. So right there, with all of us firing our weapons on full auto and with the Flyrant closing in on us, Tink and Twitch started screaming at each other like a pair of 5-year-olds. Twitch said that his bomb had to be set off right, using the Flyrant's slightly less armored underside, and Tink was equally adamant that Spot 2.0 wouldn't be set off to the same explosive death that the original Spot had been. It was one of those philosophical thingies, you know, like an unstoppable madman and an unmovable idiot, or something like that, and there was no time for this shit. Realizing that trying to argue with either of them would waste seconds we didn't have, Sarge grabbed the bag bomb and announced that his intention to bounce it off the wall below us, and told Twitch to start a countdown. This was, of course, a terrible idea. Bags of explosions with jury-rigged detonators are not known for their bouncing capabilities, in the same way that Ogrins are known for their rapier wit, but Sarge was already heftying the bag, and he was the boss, so we just sort of went with it. As Twitch counted down, Doc and Amy each grabbed one of Sarge's legs so he could lean out over the edge. Tink hastily recalled Spot to a safe distance, and Nubby helped remind everybody how much it would suck if Sarge missed. Sarge swung the bag back and forth by its straps, gauging its weight, the speed of the incoming Flyrant and the angle he'd have to hit the wall at, and then, as the countdown reached 5, decided to hell with this and just dropped the thing. The bag bomb did not sail through the air or tumble through space or anything else poetic sounding. It just dropped straight down the shaft like a backpack full of explosives, passing bare centimeters from the Flyrant's face, and jerked to a halt as one of its straps caught the demonic horns, and the bug had instead of a usual head spike. I like to imagine it stared at the big bag cross-eyed for a second as it swung there, beeping. Despite the bomb bag not being positioned in what Twitch had deemed the sweet spot, the explosion still laminated the flyrant across 3 of the shaft's walls. It was highly satisfying result, and we would have paused for a second to congratulate ourselves except for the fact that the entire shaft was making ominous creaking noises, and a thick layer of ichor and chunky salsa bits were writhing and bubbling. Within seconds, the whole mess had erupted into those hand-sized bugs that the Demonthrope liked to summon from time to time, and the last portion of our trip up the lift was spent frantically shooting and stomping the onrushing swarm. It wasn't as serious a threat as anything else the Demonthrope had thrown at us, but the final attack was enough to keep us busy until we reached the top of the shaft, and lent us all sorts of motivation to keep moving after we'd reached the bridge. We sprinted through the Occurrence Borders Bridge with ravenous tide of insects behind us, and hundreds more crawling out of every niche in the shadows of the room. The bridge, officers and their armsmen who'd apparently been too busy doing naval things to help us with the demonic flyrant ran around screaming and shooting while we weaved through them towards the door to the astropathic sanctum. Perhaps sensing that it was running out of time, the Demonthrope began emitting a constant stream of inconveniencing phenomenon. We skidded across patches of ice, were buffeted by blasts of wind, suffered dozens of painful electrical shocks, and endured the most god-awful psychic racket until we finally reached the door Jim was holding open for us. The astropathic sanctum was a hemispherical room with a massive chair covered with wires and gross-looking stains in the middle. The floor was covered with taped-down wires, markings indicate where the suppressor should be installed, and a small pile of furniture and clothes that had probably belonged to the former astropath. As we entered the room, Jim slammed the door behind us. Fumbles jumped out of the chair, and Tink brought the pallet to a skidding stop. The 3 techies hastily swapped out the cords powering the stasis unit, then all of us lifted a heavy piece of machinery off the pallet. With a quick heave, the Demonthrope holding stasis unit was deposited on the ex-astropath's chair, where it sat at a very awkward-looking, but surprisingly stable angle. As we did the heavy lifting, Theo ran around the back side of the chair, where a disorganized pile of Imperial and Tau tech was sitting at the center of the network of cables, which spread across the dome's ceiling like ivy. The Tau scientist flipped a switch and let out a panicked scream as nothing happened. Then Fumbles plugged the cord one of us had kicked loose back in, and the horrible psychic pressure of the Demonthrope's mind abruptly vanished. And that was the end of it, right there. The bugs in the bridge disappeared in puffs of smoke. The majority of the phenomena manifesting throughout the ship vanished, and all across the ship the ghost Nids lost both their focus and solidity, and stopped reappearing after death. The captain, who'd been pushed all the way back into the Gellerfield generator room, launched an immediate counterattack, which we declined to participate in on account of how the bridge lift was probably broken, and we were too tired to handle 60 feet of stairs. All of us just sat on the floor of the sanctum, utterly exhausted, watching Tink, Theo, Jim, and Fumbles argue about why the warp presence shroud Theo built around his chunk of Wraithbone was acting as a massive, demon-only psi suppressor. They seemed very agitated about the whole thing, but the rest of us really didn't care. As far as we were concerned, it just worked, which meant that we won, which meant we could sit back, and it was time for a fucking nap. We wound up camped in the Demonthropic Sanctuary for a few days, just keeping an eye on the thing, but it stayed put and didn't do anything warpy, even when the non-technomagical psi suppressors were deactivated for installation. The Demonthrope was still creepy looking, mind you, but with the metal-covered face, glowing eyes, and smoky wings, and all that, it wasn't creepy feeling anymore. When coupled with the fact that the Cogton's crater no longer screamed at people, though it couldn't be repaired, we took that as a clear sign that Theo's Wraithbone thingy had done the trick, and that the demon was being held in check. After our paranoia had abated, we descended into the ship to see how bad the damage looked. The final tally was nearly a sixth of the crew dead, and half again as many wounded, which meant that the second Doc showed his face downstairs, he was hauled off to the medbay to lend a hand, and didn't reappear for several days. On the mechanical side, the damage was considerably lighter. The Ghost Nids hadn't bothered to vandalize anything, so it was mostly a matter of unmaintained systems having problems and battle damage, most of which had been caused by us. Old Bill was especially cross about being the second time that we nearly destroyed the bridge's lift shaft, and the fact that the aft cargo lift platform was just gone. Anyway, no critical systems were damaged, and our meager fuel reserves were still intact, which meant that there was no mechanical reason to not continue our trip to the Ordos Xenos research facility. It turned out there weren't any non-mechanical reasons to stop either. The Demonthrope was secure, and now that Theo's Wraithbone thingy was doing most of the work, the suppressors were running just fine. So the big bug wasn't a problem, and while there were still a few ghost nids wandering around the tainted areas without increasing numbers to forcing them outwards, they weren't any more of an issue than anything else that haunted those decks. The Gravis situation was looking up too, much to Doc's disbelief and relief. When Doc escaped from his girlfriend for a few minutes and ran to check on Gravis, he found that despite the dead scout's harsh predictions and bisected space marine, he was doing just fine in the Demonthrope's old stasis unit. In fact, he was doing so well now that he wasn't under constant attack by spiteful possessed bug that they were able to take him out of the stasis unit long enough for Tink and Theo to get the whole thing mobile and moved up to the medbay. So we continued on our way, slowly meandering along what was probably the most ass-backwards route ever plotted by an Imperial vessel, and things slowly returned to normal. Doc doctored, Tink tinkered, though mostly on wounded armsmen and the stealth shuttle instead of Gravis or the Sanctum. Jim, Theo, and Hannah kept busy repairing the ship and trying to figure out why the Wraithbone device worked the way it did, and spent their free time annoying the hell out of the navigator next door by watching Tau vids at high volume in the Sanctum. Amy, slightly regretfully, stepped down as de facto commander of half the ship's armsmen and returned to mooching around with Tink, Twitch, Nubby, and Fumbles, though some sort of miracle all four of them kept out of trouble, at least anything serious enough to come to Sarge's attention, for the rest of the trip. Finally, Sarge was allowed a few days to plan things with the captain, then was dragged off by the relentless diplomacy adept to resume his classes. Finally, 2 weeks later, we came out of the warp in a single-planet system. The fuel situation was such that even with a minimum distance dewarp, it still took us the better part of a day to coast our way into Vox range of the small station orbiting the planet. It really says something about just how low you are when you wind up using your shuttles to push the ship a few million kilometers. As we got into Vox range, Sarge dressed up and transmitted his credentials and the contact information he'd been given as part of the mission briefing, and held his breath. But thankfully, this time the response came immediately. The occurrence border was cleared to refuel at the station, though docking was out of the question given that the occurrence border was smaller than our ship. The station was smaller than our ship. Sarge was instructed not to wait for the refueling and deliver his cargo to the research facility, which was the only thing on the desert planet, as soon as he entered the shuttle range. The relief that went through everyone on that ship at hearing all of this was massive. Doc actually cried when he heard them confirm that they had a medical facility capable of treating Tyranid biocontamination. The rest of us were more restrained, merely cheering and holding a wild party, before blearily dressing ourselves in our best uniforms and moving Gravis and the Demonthrope into the shuttle. The loading of the Demonthrope was uneventful, except for the harrowing trip down the makeshift lift, which involved a lot more swinging back and forth than seemed reasonable. It was crammed into the shuttle, along with the usual cluster of psi suppressors and a mobile version of the Wraithbone device that Theo had devised. The little Tau would not be coming down to the planet with us, this being the inquisitorial facility, and that facility experimented on Xenos and all, but he begged us to bring the Wraithbone back after the Demonthrope was delivered, which is why his device had been mounted on the Grok skull-encased spot. The shuttle that we took down was not the stealth shuttle. Tink claimed he'd gotten it to the point where it would fly and hold air even if most of the stealth bits were completely non-functional, but none of us had liked the way he kept using words like should and properly. Jim flew us down in a standard shuttle with a whole lot of patched-up bright lance holes in it, which failed to explode or do anything else interesting on its way down from the still breaking occurrence border to the research facility. As we made our final approach, we transmitted our contact codes again and were instructed to a lone landing pad which jutted out of a completely barren mountainside and bristled with anti-air turrets. Jim put the shuttle down precisely in the middle of all the turrets, and our entire party, adepts and fumbles included, as this was the official event, filed out from the shuttle. We were greeted by a party of 5 men. The man in the middle was a tall, tanned, and wore a coat that looked amazingly uncomfortable in the blistering heat of the landing pad, and had an Ordos Xenos rosette hanging from his neck, so we pegged him as Inquisitor Caesariot. He was flanked by a cogboy, a scribe who looked like he was dying of heat exhaustion, and even we immediately recognized as a pair of Deathwatch Space Marines. Sarge snapped off a parade ground salute, which earned him a kick in the shin from the diplomacy adept, and formally introduced himself as Interrogator Greg Sargent, delivering one live zoanthrope on behalf of Inquisitor Oak, as requested. He made no mention of the zoanthrope's little problem, figuring that was a discussion best had when there was no armed Space Marines present. The Inquisitor accepted Sarge's introduction with a nod and took a long look at the Demonthrope's pallet. The web of cables hooked up to the Wraithbone device obscured the wings from a cursory examination, but the man's eyes obviously lingered on the half-melted metal and the general towishness of pretty much every piece of tech on the pallet. Thankfully, he didn't start jumping up and down and screaming about heretical xenotech, and we all let out a breath of relief as he turned away from the pallet to face his two non-superhuman flunkies. That relief abruptly evaporated as he ordered them to take the zoanthrope and store it in the live sample holding cells with the rest of the evidence. Before any of us had managed to absorb the implications of that last word, the Inquisitor turned back to Sarge and announced that he, his men, and his ship were all under arrest by the joint orders of the Ordos Hereticus and the Ordos Xenos. Fumbles and Jim both let out little whimpers, and Twitch and Nubby both immediately started to go for their sidearms, but paused as the Space Marines instantly raised their bolters. The rest of us stood there, slack-jawed, until Sarge managed to ask just what in the Emperor's name we were under arrest for. The Inquisitor's face went absolutely blank, and in a voice that seemed almost mechanical, but made Fumbles shake like a leaf, he replied, "What for?" Well, most certainly disregarding an order to cease all operations and return to headquarters, the murder of 2 squads of Space Marines, the attack of an Imperial space station, and the transport of a live Xenopsyker for purposes of heretical experimentation. But the charge at the top of the list will almost certainly be aiding and abetting the rogue Inquisitor colloquially known as Oak. Well, shit!